Have you ever wondered what it felt like the very first time a human being looked into still water and realized the face staring back was their own, long before mirrors, before glass, before polished metal? There was only a trembling image in the dark, part mystery, part revelation. That single moment may have changed the way humans understood identity, memory, and even the self forever. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you love history, mystery, and the hidden turning points of the human story. Long before polished metal, before glass, before any object was shaped with the intention of showing a face, the human world exists without a stable image of itself. The sky reflects nothing back. The air offers no surface, even stone, unless worn to a rare smoothness, swallows light rather than returning it. A person can move through an entire lifetime surrounded by others, by animals, by shifting landscapes of forest, river, and dust, and yet never once see their own face in a way that holds still long enough to understand. The closest thing to a mirror is water, but water is restless. It trembles with the smallest disturbance. A passing breeze fractures the surface. A footstep near the bank sends ripples outward, dissolving any image before it forms. Even in stillness, reflections are dim, reversed, uncertain. A human leans over a river at dusk and sees something dark shapes, light shifting. Perhaps a hint of eyes, but the moment is fragile. The image breaks apart almost as soon as it appears, leaving behind more confusion than clarity. In this world, identity exists without visual confirmation. A person knows themselves through sensation, through memory, through the reactions of others. They recognize their own hands, their own voice, the rhythm of their movement. They feel hunger, warmth, pain, and the slow passage of time. But their face, the part of them that others see first, remains largely unknown. It is something described by others, hinted at in gestures, but never fully possessed. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that early humans are already deeply aware of bodies. They decorate them, mark them, alter them. Ochre stains appear on skin tens of thousands of years ago. Shell beads, animal teeth, and carved ornaments are worn close to the body. Hair is cut, arranged, perhaps braided. These actions imply a sense of appearance, of presentation, of how one is seen by others, and yet without a reliable reflective surface. All of this is done without direct visual feedback. The process is guided by touch, by imitation, by social learning. A person paints their skin not by watching their own reflection, but by remembering how others look, or by feeling the placement of pigment with their hands. They rely on the reactions of those around them, approval, attention, recognition. In a sense, the self is constructed outwardly, shaped through the eyes of the group rather than through direct self-observation. There are moments, however, when the environment briefly allows something different. A pool forms in a depression after rain. The wind falls quiet at dawn. The surface of the water settles into an almost perfect stillness, held between motion and rest. In that narrow window, light reflects more clearly, shapes sharpen, contrast deepens. A figure leaning over the edge might, for a few seconds, encounter an image that does not immediately dissolve. But even then, the experience is ambiguous. The image is inverted. It moves in perfect synchrony, yet appears separate. It is neither entirely real nor entirely illusion. The mind must interpret what it sees, and the interpretation is not obvious. scholars still debate how early humans would have processed such encounters. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the transition from seeing a shape to understanding it as oneself. It is possible that for a long time, these reflections are not recognized as self-images at all. They may be perceived as another presence, something within the water, something that appears only under certain conditions and vanishes just as quickly. In many later cultures, water surfaces are associated with spirits, with other worlds, with hidden depths that hold unseen beings. Whether such ideas reach back into deep prehistory is uncertain, but the association between reflection and mystery is strikingly persistent. Light itself complicates the experience. In low light, reflections blur into darkness. At midday, glare can overwhelm the surface, making it difficult to see anything clearly. The most revealing moments often occur at the edges of day, early morning or late afternoon, when light is soft enough to define shapes without erasing them. These are also times when human activity slows, when attention can linger, when the mind is more likely to notice subtle changes. The landscape shapes the likelihood of these encounters. Still lakes, sheltered from wind, provide better reflective surfaces than fast-moving rivers. Pools in caves or rock basins can hold water in near-perfect stillness, especially in enclosed environments where air movement is limited. Such places, rare and specific, may become focal points of unusual experiences. A person entering a cave and seeing a clear reflection in a pool beneath dim light might experience something far more striking than a fleeting glimpse at a riverbank. Yet even in the best conditions, reflections are never entirely stable. A slight movement of the head changes the angle. A drop of water disturbs the surface. The image flickers between clarity and distortion. This instability may delay recognition. It is difficult to build a concept of the self from something that refuses to remain consistent. The mind prefers patterns that repeat, that hold still long enough to be examined. At the same time, humans are already pattern-seeking beings. They recognize faces in others with remarkable sensitivity. They detect expressions, intentions, subtle shifts in emotion. This capacity is deeply embedded, essential for social life. When confronted with a reflection that resembles a face, even imperfectly, the brain is primed to respond. It sees eyes, a mouth, a shape that aligns with familiar structures. The question is not whether early humans can see faces in reflections. They almost certainly can, but whether they understand the relationship between that face and their own body. This is a different level of cognition. It requires linking visual input with internal sensation, recognizing that movement in the reflection corresponds exactly to movement of the self. It requires, in a sense, stepping outside one's own perspective and observing oneself as an object. Modern developmental psychology offers a partial window into this process. Young children do not immediately recognize themselves in mirrors. They may smile at the image, reach toward it, treat it as another child. Only after a certain stage do they begin to understand that the reflection is their own. Even then, the realization is gradual, built through repeated exposure and experimentation. If early humans follow a similar trajectory, then the first encounters with reflection are not moments of instant recognition, but part of a longer process. A person might notice that the image moves when they move, that it disappears when they step away, that it reappears when they return. Over time, patterns emerge. The reflection becomes less mysterious, more predictable, and somewhere within that gradual accumulation of experience, a shift occurs. But in the earliest phase, before that shift, the world remains largely without mirrors. Faces exist only in the perception of others. Identity is carried in memory, in voice, in the physical presence of the body, but not in a stable visual image of the self. The idea of how I look is indirect, inferred, constructed through social interaction rather than personal observation. There is a subtle consequence to this. Without mirrors, self-consciousness takes a different form. It is less about visual appearance and more about behavior, about how one is perceived in action. A person cannot easily adjust their expression by watching it. They cannot refine their appearance through repeated visual feedback. Instead, they rely on habit, on tradition, on the responses of the group. And yet, the seeds of something new are already present. The occasional reflection, however fleeting, introduces a possibility. It hints that the self can be seen from the outside, that one's own face is not just something others perceive, but something that exists as an object in the world. This idea, once fully realized, will change human experience in ways that extend far beyond the simple act of looking. For now, though, that transformation has not yet occurred. The human stands at the edge of water, the surface trembling, the image uncertain. The face that appears is both familiar and strange, present and unreachable. It flickers, distorts, vanishes. And the mind, still learning how to interpret such a sight, holds the moment without yet understanding its full significance. The first clear reflection does not happen in the middle of a crowded camp, or while a person is busy with tools, fire, and conversation. It is more likely to happen in a pause, a quiet margin of the day, a moment when attention is not fixed on survival, but drifts outward into the stillness of a place. Dawn is especially suited to it. Wind is often low. The angle of the light is gentle. Water, if sheltered, becomes briefly smooth enough to gather an image instead of scattering it. A person comes to the edge of a pool for reasons that have nothing to do with self-discovery. To drink, to wash mud from the hands, to look for fish in the shallows, to inspect tracks left overnight near the bank. The water is not a tool for thought. It is simply part of the landscape. One more surface among many, but on certain mornings, under very specific conditions, it behaves differently. It stops being just water and becomes a kind of threshold. The surface darkens and brightens at once. Shadows hold beneath it, but light rests on top. A face appears there not complete at first, not crisp in the way a modern mirror would show it, but coherent enough to disturb the ordinary logic of perception. Two eyes where eyes should be, the bridge of a nose, the outline of hair or brow, the movement of the mouth, delayed by no visible interval, matching every small shift above the waterline with impossible precision. What survives in the record suggests that human beings long before recorded history are attentive observers of pattern and movement. They notice animal behavior, weather shifts, changes in terrain, the color of fruit before ripening, the difference between fresh tracks and old ones. This sensitivity is essential. A life lived close to danger depends on reading surfaces correctly. Yet here is a surface that behaves in a way no stone, bark, or hide behaves. It produces a duplicate, but only in light. It offers shape without substance. It presents a face that can never be touched without destroying it. That tension may be central to the experience. A reflection is visible, but inaccessible. Reach toward it and the water breaks. Cup it in the hands and it vanishes. Move too quickly and it fragments into brightness. Even after the mind begins to notice the correspondence between body and image, the phenomenon remains elusive. It resists possession. It exists only under conditions of calm, distance, and restraint. Scholars still debate how much cognitive sophistication is required for genuine self-recognition in such circumstances. The evidence remains incomplete because reflections leave no direct archaeological trace. There is no preserved first look, no ancient testimony from the people who first leaned over still water and saw more than darkness. What can be studied instead are the conditions under which recognition becomes plausible, the emergence of symbolic behavior, the increasing complexity of social life, the growth of memory, planning, imitation, and mental modeling in Homo sapiens and perhaps in some earlier human groups. That makes the first sustained reflection not just an optical event, but a meeting between a mind and a pattern. The image alone is not enough. A creature may notice motion, contrast, even resemblance, without understanding identity. The human mind, however, is increasingly able to connect separate kinds of information. It can hold an image and a bodily sensation together. It can test the link, tilt the head. The image tilts. Raise a hand. The image raises one too. Lean closer. It approaches. Pull back. It withdraws. The pattern repeats. The duplicate obeys too perfectly to be another being. Still, recognition may not arrive in a single flash. It may unfold in stages so subtle that no one alive at the time would think of them as stages at all. At first there is surprise, then curiosity, then experimentation, then familiarity. A person may return to the same pool more than once, deliberately or half-consciously, to confirm what was seen before. The same face appears. The same motions correspond. The surface begins to teach. Landscape matters here more than it might seem. A rushing river offers too much distortion. Marsh water is often clouded. Wind-blown lakes produce only fragments. The best natural mirrors are often the least dramatic places: a shaded rock basin filled by rain, a spring pool protected by reeds, a narrow inlet untouched by current, a cave chamber where water lies flat in darkness. These are not grand settings, but precise ones. The first human reflection, if it becomes meaningful, likely emerges in a place where stillness is more important than scale. There is something almost accidental about that. One of the most profound changes in human experience may depend, at first, on whether the air is quiet, on whether the sun is low but not blinding, on whether the pool is clear enough and undisturbed long enough for a face to gather on its surface. The self may begin to come into view not through invention, but through a lucky arrangement of environment and attention. And once that arrangement occurs, the emotional effect may be difficult to separate from the practical one. Even modern people, fully accustomed to mirrors, can be unsettled by seeing their face under unusual conditions, in dark water, in poor light, in distorted glass, in the sudden stillness of an unexpected reflection. The prehistoric experience may be calmer or stranger, but not trivial. A face encountered outside the body, moving with the body, invites a different kind of awareness. It makes the self visible in a new register. The body is no longer only felt from within, it is now observed from without. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. That shift may sound abstract, but it has practical consequences. A person who can observe their face, even imperfectly, gains information that would otherwise belong only to others. A cut on the brow, pigment across the cheek, aging around the eyes, the arrangement of hair, traces of ash or blood, all become visible in a new way. At first, the information is limited by the quality of the reflection, but even a rough image changes the balance between self-perception and social perception. No single explanation fully accounts for how early humans responded to this. Some encounters may have been treated casually, others may have been charged with fear or amusement or fascination. The same person may respond differently depending on context. In ordinary daylight, the reflection is just a useful curiosity. In a dark pool beneath a cave wall, it may feel like something else entirely. Human perception is never merely optical. It is shaped by setting, expectation, memory, and emotion. There is also the problem of repetition. Recognition likely requires not one encounter, but many. A single glimpse can be dismissed or misunderstood. Repeated experiences allow the brain to stabilize meaning. This is one reason children, even with access to perfect modern mirrors, do not instantly understand what they see. They learn by exposure. They test the world and discover consistency. Early humans, exposed only to irregular natural reflections, would have to build that understanding more slowly, and yet the very rarity of clear reflections may make them memorable. An unusual event tends to stay in the mind longer than an ordinary one. A face seen in still water at sunrise may become one of those moments that lingers, even if its meaning is not fully grasped at first. It may be recalled later when another reflection appears somewhere else, in a rain pool, in a dark vessel of water, on the polished surface of wet stone after a storm. Gradually the mind assembles a category from scattered encounters. This may be the beginning of something larger than self-recognition alone. To understand a reflection is to understand representation. It is to accept that an image can stand in for a thing without being that thing. That idea will later become central to art, symbol, ritual, portraiture, and abstraction itself. But here, at the water's edge, it exists in its simplest and most intimate form, the face and its double. The double is important. Across human history, reflected selves are rarely neutral. They carry a slight unease, a sense of separation within sameness. Even after mirrors become common, many traditions continue to treat reflections as vulnerable, powerful, or spiritually dangerous. That persistence hints at something deep in the original experience. The image is the self, yet not the self. It belongs to the body, yet hovers outside it. It is exact, yet intangible. It is familiar, yet somehow uncanny. In the first stage of reflection, this uncanniness may outweigh usefulness. A person kneeling at a pool sees not merely a practical likeness, but an impossible event. A face lives where no body is. It occupies depth without entering it. It vanishes if touched. It returns if one waits. It can be interrupted by a leaf falling onto the surface or by a fish rising from below. The world seems, for a brief moment, to contain another layer. What survives in the scientific and anthropological records suggests that humans are especially prone to investing ambiguous phenomena with meaning. We do not merely register strange patterns, we interpret them. We connect them to memory and story. It is therefore plausible, though impossible to prove in any single case, that early reflections are not just noticed but remembered as meaningful events. Perhaps not every time, perhaps not everywhere, but often enough to matter. So the first sustained reflection is not simply the first time a human face appears in water. That may happen many times without consequence. What matters is the moment when someone lingers long enough, under calm enough conditions, with a mind prepared enough by experience to recognize the strange precision of what is happening. A surface in the world has become a kind of answer, Not yet a mirror in the manufactured sense, not yet a controlled tool, but already more than landscape. The water holds the image for a few seconds more. The face above and the face below remain locked together. One breath, one movement, one visible correspondence repeated again and again until accident begins to harden into understanding. And from that point on, however slowly, the human relationship to the self can no longer remain entirely the same. At first, the reflection is only a phenomenon, a trick of surface and light, a face that appears where no face should be, obedient to movement, impossible to hold. But the deeper change begins when that appearance stops being merely strange and starts becoming meaningful. The moment is easy to underestimate from a world filled with mirrors, cameras, polished windows, and dark phone screens that return a face whenever they are lifted. In the deep human past, to see the self from the outside is not ordinary. It is a mental threshold. A person who recognizes a reflection as their own image is doing something more than identifying a shape. They're connecting two versions of the self that are usually kept apart. There is the inner self, known through movement, touch, balance, pain, intention. And there is the outer self, the visible form presented to everyone else. For most of human existence, that outer self is largely inaccessible except through social response. Others see the face, the person inhabiting it does not. Reflection changes that arrangement. It allows the self to become, in part, an object of observation. That shift may happen gradually enough to leave no obvious boundary. A person sees a face in water many times before fully trusting what the face means. Yet once the association settles into place, the world subtly reorganizes. A new kind of knowledge becomes possible. One can now compare how it feels to move with how movement looks. One can discover that emotion leaves traces on the face, that aging changes features, that ornament and pigment alter appearance in ways that can be inspected rather than imagined. Scholars still debate how closely self-recognition should be linked to symbolic thought, but the two seem to develop in the same broad cognitive landscape. By at least the Upper Paleolithic, humans are not only surviving, they are representing. They paint animals deep inside caves. They carve figures from bone and ivory. They mark bodies and objects with patterns that serve no immediate utilitarian purpose. These acts suggest a mind comfortable with symbols, with things that stand for other things, with appearances that carry meaning beyond their material form. A reflection belongs to that same realm, though in a more intimate register. It is not a drawing of the face, not an imagined likeness, but an image nonetheless. It is a representation generated by the world rather than by the hand. To understand it is to accept that appearance can be detached from substance without becoming meaningless. That is not the whole of symbolic thinking, but it resonates with it. The face in the water is both oneself and not oneself, both present and displaced. The mind must hold both truths at once. No single explanation fully accounts for what this does to human consciousness, but it likely intensifies something already emerging reflexive thought, the ability to think not just about the world, but about oneself within the world. A creature may be aware, socially intelligent, emotionally complex, and still not habitually turn inward in this way. Humans do. They track status, intention, reputation, memory, future plans. They imagine what others know. They anticipate judgment. They place themselves inside stories. Reflection may not create this capacity, but it gives it a visible anchor. Once a face can be seen from outside, the self becomes easier to imagine as others see it. This matters in a species whose survival depends so heavily on cooperation. Group life is not just a matter of strength or numbers, it rests on interpretation. Who is angry? Who is grieving? Who is trustworthy? Who is weak? Who belongs? Long before mirrors are made, human beings are already reading these things in one another's faces. The reflected image may allow a person, however imperfectly, to enter that system from the other side. That does not mean early humans immediately become vain or self-absorbed. Those are much later moral categories, and even then they oversimplify. What reflection introduces is not vanity first, but perspective. It shows that the self has an exterior. It suggests that appearance is part of reality, not just social rumor. A painted cheek is not only something another person sees, it is something the wearer can perhaps glimpse. A wound is not only felt, it is visible. A gesture is not only performed, it has form. The consequences extend beyond practical knowledge. There's also a new kind of emotional distance. To see oneself is to become, for a moment, both subject and observer. That can be stabilizing, even useful. It can also be unsettling. The reflected self is undeniably connected to the body, yet slightly detached from it, existing at a remove. This can produce recognition, but also estrangement. Many later traditions will interpret this doubled condition in spiritual terms, linking reflections with souls, shadows, doubles, or hidden selves. The evidence remains incomplete for how early such associations begin, but the psychological seed is easy to see. What survives in the record suggests that human beings are especially sensitive to faces because faces concentrate information. Small changes around the eyes and mouth carry social meaning. The reflected face, therefore, provides a dense field of self-information, even in crude form. A person who notices that they look different after fear, after effort, after age, or after ritual decoration is noticing something profound. The body carries history on its surface. The self is not only lived internally, it is inscribed externally. This may also deepen memory. A person without reflection still remembers events, but reflection gives memory a visible hook. The face becomes something that changes over time and can, under the right conditions, be compared against earlier impressions. Perhaps not precisely, not with the precision of a modern mirror, but enough to sharpen awareness that the self is not fixed. Scars appear, hair greys, features age, childhood gives way to adulthood. A reflection offers proof that time has worked on the body even when the internal sense of continuity remains strong. There is a lesser-known possibility here as well. Some cognitive scientists and philosophers have suggested that self-recognition is not simply about identifying one's face, but about building a model of oneself as an entity that exists continuously across different contexts. In that view, reflection matters because it binds bodily sensation, social identity, and visual form into a more unified concept. It is one thing to know, from the inside, that you are the one moving. It is another to see that movement translated into visible appearance and understand both as the same being. If that is even partly true, then reflection may contribute to the strengthening of personhood in the abstract sense. Not personhood as law or philosophy will later define it, but the felt sense that one is a singular self with a body, a face, a past, and a place in the eyes of others. That sense is never created by reflection alone. It arises from language, memory, kinship, ritual, and shared life. But reflection could reinforce it in a vivid and memorable way. This is where the experience begins to move beyond surprise into meaning. The water no longer shows only an odd image. It shows me. That recognition, however slowly formed, rearranges attention. A person may start checking their reflection deliberately when conditions allow. They may lean over a pool not just to drink, but to inspect paint, injury, or adornment. The event becomes repeatable, even if the environmental conditions are unpredictable. Once the mind knows what a reflection is, it can seek it, and once it can be sought, it can be used. That is still far in the future at this stage, because natural reflections remain unreliable. But the logic has begun. If an image of the self is valuable, even intermittently, then surfaces that provide it more clearly gain importance. Calm water becomes more than water. Smooth dark stone becomes more than stone. A polished object, if such polishing is discovered and refined, will carry possibilities that earlier generations could scarcely have articulated, but would immediately recognize in practice. There is also the question of other people. Self-recognition is never only solitary in a social species. If one person discovers the relationship between face and reflection, that knowledge can be demonstrated. Another can be brought to the edge of water, shown the synchrony of motion, guided toward the same recognition. Children may learn it from adults. Ritual specialists may exploit it. Groups may assign meaning to places where reflections are especially clear. What begins as an individual encounter can become collective understanding. Yet the experience retains something private. A reflected face reveals something no one else can fully mediate. Others can tell you how you look, but only reflection lets you meet your own gaze, however dimly and however briefly. That encounter may be practical, eerie, moving, or unremarkable depending on the setting and the mind involved. But it is unlike any other perception in the human sensory world. It is the self returned by the environment. No single explanation fully accounts for when the first human truly understands this, or whether it happens many times in many places rather than once in some dramatic beginning. What is clear is that the capacity, once present, changes the texture of being human. It creates a bridge between interior awareness and exterior form. It prepares the mind for representation, for self-consciousness, for the management of appearance, for the strange knowledge that the face others read every day can also, under the right conditions, be read by the person who wears it. And so the reflection becomes more than a visual event. It becomes a lesson, not spoken, not recorded, not preserved in any direct way, but repeated across quiet mornings and sheltered pools until its meaning settles into human life. A surface outside the body begins to hold the body's image. A mind inside the body begins to understand. And in that narrow meeting between water and thought, the self takes on a new shape. Long before any human kneels over still water and fully understands what is looking back, the mind has to become the kind of mind that can understand such a thing at all. A reflection is not difficult in the way a spear point is difficult, or fire, or the tracking of an animal across broken ground. It does not demand force or technique. It demands interpretation. The challenge lies not in making the image appear, but in grasping the invisible relationship between the image and the self. That relationship depends on a deep set of mental abilities that take shape over a very long span of human evolution. The earliest members of the human line already live in social worlds that reward attention, memory, imitation, and anticipation. They read one another's bodies, they learn by watching, they form bonds, compete, cooperate, mourn, and plan. Over hundreds of thousands, then millions of years, these capacities become more elaborate. Hands grow more skillful, but so do minds. Stone tools are shaped not only with force, but with foresight. A maker must hold the desired form in mind before it exists. This is a modest kind of abstraction, but an important one. It suggests a brain increasingly able to map between reality and representation. By the time Homo sapiens emerges, that capacity has deepened dramatically. Symbolic behavior appears with growing clarity, though scholars still debate how sudden or gradual the process truly is. Pigments are collected and processed, beads are drilled and strung, marks are incised on ochre, bone, and stone in patterns whose meaning is no longer purely functional. Burials in some places seem to involve intention beyond disposal alone. Cave walls become surfaces for animals, signs, and handprints. What survives in the record suggests that humans are no longer merely reacting to the world. They are representing it, storing meaning outside the body, shaping matter into signs. This is the cognitive landscape in which reflection becomes legible. A face in water is not simply a face, it is an image standing in place of a body. To recognize it as oneself requires an ability to treat appearances as linked to realities without confusing the two. A human who can make a painted hand on cave stone, or understand that a carved figure resembles an animal without being that animal, is already inhabiting a world where representation makes sense. Reflection is stranger than art because it is not made by human intention, but it belongs to the same broad territory of mind. There is no single point in prehistory where scholars can declare that self-recognition arrives. The evidence remains incomplete, and it almost certainly does not arrive all at once. Yet several lines of research help narrow the possibilities. One comes from the development of theory of mind, the human ability to infer that other beings have perspectives, knowledge, and intentions different from one's own. Another comes from episodic memory, the ability to mentally revisit past experiences and project oneself into possible futures. Another comes from body representation, the brain's internal mapping of posture, movement, and physical form. Reflection draws on all of these. It links visible appearance to the body schema, compares current perception with stored self-models, and allows the observer to treat the self as both subject and object at once. This kind of reflexive awareness may have older roots than our species alone. Neanderthals, for example, are no longer seen as cognitively simple. They produce tools of great sophistication, use pigments, care for injured individuals, and perhaps engage in symbolic practices of their own. The gap between them and Homo sapiens is narrower than once imagined. If still water showed them a face moving in synchrony, it is entirely plausible that they too could have recognized the relationship. At least in some cases. The same may be true, though with greater uncertainty, for other archaic humans near the end of their existence. No direct evidence survives to settle the question. Modern comparisons can help, but only carefully. Developmental psychology shows that human infants do not begin life with full mirror self-recognition. The capacity usually appears in early childhood, after a longer period of bodily exploration, social interaction, and cognitive growth. Children first treat reflected images as social stimuli. They smile, point, or attempt contact. Only later do they begin to test the link between their own movement and the image. Eventually they understand that the face in the mirror is their own. This pattern suggests that self-recognition is not automatic, even for a modern human brain. It depends on maturation and repeated experience. If that is true in children who live among perfect mirrors, then prehistoric recognition likely depends on both cognition and opportunity. The mind must be ready. and the environment must provide enough encounters for the pattern to stabilize. A species can possess the underlying capacity long before the average individual frequently exercises it. This helps explain why the story cannot be told as a single invention. The potential may be ancient, but its lived expression may remain irregular for tens of thousands of years. Another clue comes from the neurological architecture of the face itself. Humans devote extraordinary cognitive resources to faces. Specialized regions of the brain respond to facial structure and expression with speed and precision. Faces matter because social life depends on reading them. The reflected face therefore enters a system already primed for intense interpretation. The problem is not detecting the face, it is assigning it correctly. Once the brain notices that the face and the body move together in perfect correspondence, recognition becomes possible in a way that recognizing one's own footprint or handprint might not be. The reflection is dynamic. It behaves as a visible extension of the self. No single explanation fully accounts for why humans in particular build so much meaning on top of this. Chimpanzees, bonobos, dolphins, elephants, and a few other animals show some evidence of self-recognition under experimental conditions, though even there the findings are debated and vary by method. Humans, however, do something more elaborate. We do not stop at recognition. We turn reflected appearance into grooming, status display, beauty norms, ritual symbolism, portraiture, performance, and moral judgment. This suggests that the cognitive foundation is only part of the story. The rest comes from culture, language, and the human tendency to accumulate meanings around every powerful perception. Language may be especially important, even if self-recognition is not dependent on words in any absolute sense. To have words for face, self, seeing, appearance, resemblance, beauty, age, wound, or spirit is to create a network into which reflection can be fitted. A perception that might otherwise remain eerie and private can become shareable. Someone can indicate the water, gesture to the face, describe the likeness, connect it to body paint or identity or taboo. Language turns singular experience into collective knowledge. It also allows communities to layer explanation over perception. The face in water is me, or it is my double, or it is a sign, or it is a dangerous threshold. Once named, the image becomes culturally active. This is one reason the ancient mind does not simply awaken in an instant. Despite the dramatic appeal of that idea, it develops unevenly, across generations, landscapes, and human groups living under different conditions. Coastal people, riverine people, people near clear springs, people using dark polished stone, people inhabiting caves with still pools, all may encounter reflections with different frequency and meaning. A cognitive ability can exist widely while its cultural significance remains local and variable. The evidence that survives to us is frustratingly fragmentary, because so much of this happens in places that leave almost nothing behind. What survives in the record does, however, show a growing human appetite for surfaces that hold or transform meaning. Cave walls, body skin, carved objects, beads, ochre plaques, shell ornaments, and eventually polished artifacts all participate in an expanding world of managed appearance. Humans do not merely live in environments, they alter the visual field around themselves. They make symbols visible, they make identities visible, they make stories visible. Against that backdrop, the importance of reflection becomes easier to understand. It is one more step in a broader pattern, the externalization of the self. There is a surprising detail here. The earliest known human images are often not faces, they are animals, signs, hands, body forms, and abstract patterns. The face, despite being central to social life, is comparatively elusive in early art. Scholars still debate why. One possibility is that the face is difficult to render convincingly. Another is that it carries special power or taboo. Another is simply that the available evidence is biased by what survives. But it is tempting to wonder whether the difficulty of regularly seeing one's own face contributes to its relative absence. A species that knows faces intimately through others may still find its own face conceptually unstable for a long time. Reflection begins to change that instability. It does not solve it immediately, and the evidence remains incomplete, but it gives humans access to a form of self-observation that had previously belonged almost entirely to the social world. In doing so, it supports a more explicit awareness of personal appearance, bodily continuity, and visible identity. The ancient mind, then, does not awaken because of reflection alone. It awakens through a long convergence of memory, language, symbolism, social intelligence, and bodily awareness. Reflection enters that convergence as both catalyst and confirmation. By the time a human can look into still water and know, with some confidence, that the moving face below is their own, an immense evolutionary history already stands behind that moment. Toolmakers, painters, wanderers, mourners, storytellers, imitators, and watchers have prepared the ground. The pool itself is silent. The image on it lasts only seconds. But the mind meeting that image is the product of hundreds of thousands of years of becoming. And that is why the simple act of seeing a face in water is never merely simple. It is the meeting point of light, surface, and one of the most complicated forms of self-awareness the natural world has produced. The places where humans first see themselves clearly are not distributed evenly across the world. Reflection is a universal possibility, but not a universal experience in the same way. It depends on materials, weather, terrain, and light. A human group living beside fast, muddy water may have countless opportunities to drink and wash, yet very few chances to see a stable face. Another group moving through karst country, spring-fed basins, or sheltered volcanic pools may encounter still reflective surfaces often enough for them to become familiar, memorable, perhaps even charged with meaning. In this sense, the first reflections belong not just to the mind, but to geography. Water is the obvious medium, but not all water behaves the same. Rivers are usually too active, lakes too exposed, marshes too clouded, the sea too broken by swell and glare. The best natural mirrors are often small and protected spring pools beneath rock overhangs, rain-filled basins in stone, calm inlets before sunrise, cave pools where no wind reaches the surface. These are intimate places. They do not overwhelm with scale. Instead, they gather conditions so finely balanced that the world above can appear on the world below almost without distortion. Such places tend to feel unusual even without reflection. Springs are cold beyond the surrounding air. Cave chambers carry echoes and damp stillness. Rock basins collect leaves, insects, ash, and light in peculiar combinations. Water emerging from the ground has, in many cultures, been treated as powerful, sacred, dangerous, or alive. Scholars still debate how far back such associations go, and the evidence remains incomplete. But what survives in the anthropological record suggests that humans repeatedly invest unusual water sources with ritual attention. Reflection may be part of that story, not its only cause, but one force among several that makes certain surfaces feel more than merely practical. The cave is especially important here. A cave is already a threshold space, neither fully part of open landscape nor fully severed from it. Light enters unevenly, sound changes, surfaces glisten. Water in caves can remain astonishingly still, especially in chambers where air is quiet and the basin is protected from disturbance. A person entering such a place with firelight, or in dim natural light at the entrance, may encounter a reflection that seems to arise from darkness itself. The face appears below, detached from ordinary surroundings, hovering in black depth. Even a modern viewer can find such an image uncanny. For prehistoric humans, the effect may have been intense. This matters because the same caves that preserve some of humanity's earlier symbolic art often preserve signs that they were not ordinary living spaces. Deep cave art in Ice Age Europe, for example, frequently appears in acoustically or spatially unusual chambers. Far from daily habitation, the reasons remain debated. Some scholars emphasize ritual, altered states, social performance, or cosmological belief. Others warn against imposing too much coherence on fragmentary evidence. But however one interprets the art, caves are clearly places where humans do something more than shelter. They enter, mark, return, and remember. A reflective pool in such a setting would not be neutral. Beyond caves, there are also open landscapes where water behaves in surprising ways. Desert basins after rain can become temporary mirrors, turning the sky downward and making the ground appear doubled. High mountain tarns, sheltered by rock and reached in thin, cold air, can hold reflections with extraordinary clarity when wind falls. Volcanic terrains sometimes create dark pools edged with black stone, where light and shadow sharpen contrast. Forest ponds, enclosed by still trunks at dawn, can become almost glass-like for a few minutes each day. These are not just reflective surfaces. They are environmental events, moments when landscape briefly acquires an additional layer. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that humans are keenly responsive to such places. Sacred geography is one of the oldest and most persistent features of human life. Certain springs, caves, mountaintops, groves, river confluences, and islands repeatedly attract attention out of proportion to their practical use. Objects are deposited there, paths converge there, marks accumulate there, bodies are buried there. The reasons are rarely singular. Water, danger, acoustics, seclusion, fertility, memory, and myth often overlap. Reflection may have helped some of these sites become memorable, because it turns a place into something that answers back visually. That visual answer is subtle but powerful. Most of the landscape can be looked at without the landscape looking back. A reflective surface changes that relation. It returns an image. It does not merely receive the gaze, it produces one. This may be one reason still water so often acquires an aura of watchfulness or depth in later traditions. Even when people know exactly how reflection works, they continue to feel that dark water contains another presence. The image is their own, but it arrives from below, from a surface that seems both passive and alive. There is also the role of polished stone, which stands halfway between found reflection and made reflection. Certain stones, especially dark volcanic glass such as obsidian, can show partial images if broken or worked to smoothness. Wet stone surfaces can do the same under low light. Long before mirrors are deliberately crafted, humans encounter materials that occasionally return fragments of the face: a polished axe head, a dark stone blade, a smoothed pebble used repeatedly in the hand. None of these is a perfect mirror, but each hints that reflection can live in matter other than water. This expands the geography of self-seeing from place to object, even if only faintly at first. No single explanation fully accounts for when humans begin to notice and value these properties, yet the logic is compelling. A species already attentive to unusual materials would not ignore a surface that can briefly show a face. Obsidian is not only sharp, it is dark, lustrous, and visually distinctive. Wet black stone does not only gleam, it gathers light in a way that feels different from ordinary rock. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is plausible that some materials became meaningful in part because of their visual depth and reflective capacity, not only because of their utility. Light remains the unseen partner in all of this. Reflection is not inherent in water or stone alone. It emerges through the interaction of surface and illumination. Dawn and dusk often produce the best results because the light is angled and softened. Firelight introduces another possibility, flickering, unstable, far less precise, but emotionally potent. A face reflected in water beside a fire would seem to breathe and distort, appearing and disappearing with every movement of flame. Such images may not support reliable self-inspection, but they could easily support story, ritual, or unease. This helps explain why reflective places may become symbolic before they become practical. The first importance of a still pool may not be that it helps someone arrange pigment on the face. It may be that it feels like a threshold between forms of reality, sky and earth, body and image, life and underworld, visible world and hidden depth. Later cultures again and again imagine water as a boundary between worlds, between life and death, between seen and unseen. It would be careless to project every later belief backward into prehistory, but the recurring pattern is hard to dismiss completely. The physical behavior of reflection lends itself to metaphysical interpretation. The surprising detail is that the same place can be both useful and uncanny. A spring is a source of water and a source of strange images. A cave pool offers clean water and a dark doubled face. A volcanic glass blade cuts flesh and also flashes back part of the hand holding it. Humans are especially likely to mark significance where practical value and perceptual strangeness overlap. The sacred and the useful often emerge together, not separately. A place that sustains life and disrupts ordinary perception is a strong candidate for memory, repetition, and taboo. Over time, familiarity may soften some of the strangeness, but perhaps never all of it. A person who repeatedly uses the same reflective pool begins to understand how it behaves. They learn when the wind is low, where to stand, how to lean without disturbing the surface too much. The image becomes more dependable, yet its basic properties remain impossible in a way visible but untouchable, exact but empty. Even once recognized as self, it never becomes entirely ordinary. A reflection is always a little haunted by the conditions of its appearance. What survives in the broader human record suggests that landscapes are not merely backgrounds to cognition. They shape thought by shaping repeated experience. To grow up where still water is common is to grow up with more frequent access to one's visual double. To grow up where reflective surfaces are rare is to live more fully inside the old human condition in which the face remains socially known but personally elusive. That difference may seem small, yet over generations it could influence how quickly groups come to incorporate reflection into grooming, symbolism, and craft. This is why rivers, pools, caves, and polished stones deserve more attention than they usually receive in stories about the self. The first human reflection is not just a psychological milestone. It is a meeting of mind with environment. Without sheltered surfaces, there is no image to interpret. without the right light. There is no face to read, without places that repeatedly hold stillness. There is no chance for the image to become familiar enough to matter. Geography, in its quiet way, helps invent the visible self. So the story moves outward from the face and into the world that makes the face visible. A calm spring under stone, a cave pool holding firelight, a basin after rain reflecting a dawn sky, and the outline of a human leaning closer. In such places, the surface does more than mirror. It gathers mystery, memory, and repetition. And once enough of those gather together, a landscape feature becomes something else, a place where the self can appear. One of the clearest ways to imagine the first human experience of reflection is not to look outward into archaeology, but inward into development. Every human life begins, in a sense, without a stable visual self. A child enters the world surrounded by faces, yet unable to place their own among them. They are touched, carried, named, soothed, watched, and read by others long before they can recognize themselves as an image. The self begins in sensation and relationship first, and only later becomes something visible from the outside. This matters because it offers a modern echo of a very ancient condition. Even now, in a world saturated with mirrors, polished metal, and screens, self-recognition is not immediate. It is learned. A young child may laugh at a mirror, reach toward it, treat the reflection as another child, or simply stare. The eyes lock onto a face because human brains are drawn to faces from the earliest months of life, but the understanding comes later. At first, the image is socially interesting. Only gradually does it become personally meaningful. The classic experiments are simple. A mark is placed on a child's forehead without their knowledge. When they're brought before a mirror, researchers observe what happens. A child who reaches toward the reflected image as though the mark belongs to someone else has not yet made the connection. A child who touches their own forehead has, at least at a basic level, understood that the image corresponds to the self. This so-called mirror test is not a perfect measure of consciousness. Scholars still debate its limits, its cultural assumptions, and what exactly it proves, but it remains useful as a rough window into how self-recognition emerges. What it suggests is not that the self suddenly appears, but that different layers of selfhood come online at different times. Even before passing any mirror test, children already know much about themselves. They distinguish their own movements from outside forces. They have preferences, memories, attachments, expectations. They react differently to their own body than to objects. In other words, the self exists before the reflected self. Reflection does not create identity. It reveals a new dimension of it. That is likely true in prehistory as well. The first humans to recognize their reflections are not discovering personhood for the first time. They already live within names, kinship, status, memory, desire, grief, and role. They already know their own bodies from the inside and others' bodies from the outside. What reflection adds is a bridge between those two domains. And children show how non-trivial that bridge really is. The brain must coordinate sight, movement, prediction. And representation, it must realize that the face over there belongs to the body here. The evidence remains incomplete when we try to project this process backward into the deep past. But the analogy is compelling. A prehistoric human standing over still water may be in a similar cognitive position to a child at the mirror's edge, not in intelligence overall, certainly not in maturity or practical knowledge, but in the specific challenge of mapping visual likeness onto the self. At first there may be social curiosity. then surprise at synchrony, then testing, a tilt of the head, a lifted hand, a pause. Recognition grows through repeated alignment between action and image. There is another useful comparison. Children do not learn self-recognition in isolation. They are embedded in a social world that constantly names, points, imitates, and responds. Adults may stand behind them, gesture toward the mirror, laugh, repeat the child's name, touch the child and the reflected body in turn. Language and social scaffolding accelerate the realization. The reflected image becomes intelligible, not simply because the child sees it, but because the community helps frame what is being seen. That may also have been true for early humans. Once some individuals understood the relationship between reflection and self, they could help others understand it too. A mother could lead a child to a still pool and show the moving likeness. An older sibling could gesture, smile, touch their own face, then point to the face below. A group could gather around a calm basin and share the discovery in a way no solitary individual ever fully could. Recognition, though deeply personal in its final form, may have been socially taught. This social dimension changes the emotional quality of the event. Alone, a reflection might be eerie; in company, it might become playful, instructive, even ordinary. Children today often oscillate between fascination and delight when mirrors first begin to make sense. It is easy to imagine similar reactions in prehistory, even if the setting is a rain pool instead of polished glass. The atmosphere need not always be solemn. Not every major shift in human experience arrives under the weight of ritual. Some begin in curiosity, in repetition, in the communal pleasure of noticing something strange and learning how it works. Still, children also remind us that self-recognition can sharpen self-consciousness. Once a child understands that the reflection is me, they begin to inspect themselves differently. They may notice food on the face, paint on the skin, odd expressions, or the arrangement of hair. Embarrassment becomes easier. Performance becomes easier too. The body can now be adjusted with an imagined audience in mind, because the self can partly occupy that audience's perspective. In this sense, mirrors do not merely reveal the face, they train the mind to monitor the face. That capacity may have ancient roots. A prehistoric person who understands reflection gains a new way of preparing for social encounters. Pigment can be checked, a wound can be examined, expressions can be observed, however roughly. Ornament can be placed with more precision. None of this requires vanity in the modern sense. It only requires that appearance begins to matter not just because others see it, but because the self can inspect it too. Reflection makes external form available for self-management. The role of touch is also revealing. Children often learn the meaning of reflection by combining sight with bodily sensation. They see a hand lift and feel their hand lift. They touch the mark on their face after seeing it in the mirror. The body confirms what the image suggests. This combination likely mattered enormously in early human recognition. A face alone in water might remain ambiguous, but when the observer moves a hand, feels the motion, and sees the reflected hand rise at the same moment, the pattern tightens. The self is stitched together across senses. No single explanation fully accounts for how quickly or universally ancient humans would have made that connection. Some may have done so with ease. Others may have remained uncertain, especially where reflections were rare and unstable. Children today vary in timing even under ideal conditions, and cultural differences may influence how much importance is given to mirrors and reflected play. That warns against imagining one neat prehistoric threshold crossed by everyone at once. Human experience is messier than that. and the first reflective insights likely arrived unevenly across populations and generations. There is also a deeper lesson hidden in childhood comparison. The self is not discovered once and then finished. It is built, revised, layered. A child recognizes their face, then later recognizes age, attractiveness, difference, injury, social judgment, and style. Reflection remains the same basic phenomenon, but its meaning grows with the mind. Prehistoric humans may have followed a similar path at the scale of culture. First comes simple correspondence that is me, then practical use. This shows my paint, my scar, my hair. Then symbolic use, this image is tied to spirit, status, danger, ritual, memory. Reflection deepens as culture deepens around it. A lesser-known detail from developmental research makes this even more interesting. Some scholars argue that self-recognition is not only about identifying the face, but about tolerating a split perspective on the self. To recognize the mirror image, one must accept that I can be both the one looking and the one looked at. Children grow into this capacity. Humans as a species may have expanded it into something extraordinary, the ability to turn inward, narrate the self, perform the self, discipline the self, and imagine the self as seen by countless other minds. That larger expansion begins with very small acts. A child touching their own forehead after seeing a mark in the glass. A person at a spring pool realizing that the image moves because they move. The gulf between those scenes is immense in time and culture, but the structure of the realization is surprisingly similar. A surface offers an image, the body offers sensation, the mind connects them and finds, in that connection, a new fact about being alive. What survives in the record suggests that human beings are born prepared for this connection, but not completed by it. The capacity waits for the right developmental moment, the right environment, the right repetition. That is why childhood matters to this story. It reveals that the first human reflections are unlikely to have been dramatic single epiphanies detached from ordinary life. More likely, they belong to the slow rhythm through which perception becomes meaning. A person grows into their reflected self much as a child does through encounter, confusion, testing, and then a sudden seeming familiarity that has actually been building for some time. So the ancient water surface and the modern mirror quietly illuminate one another. Both show that the self is never only inward. It is also something assembled through surfaces, gestures, and social learning. Before humans crafted mirrors, children were already recapitulating in miniature the long species history of coming to terms with a face that belongs to them but appears outside them. And that may be the most human part of the story, not that we saw ourselves once, but that we learned, again and again, what it means to do so. At the water's edge, the human story of reflection appears singular, almost lonely, as if no other creature stands near it. But the wider natural world complicates that sense of uniqueness. Humans are not the only beings capable of responding to an image as though it might, under certain conditions, refer back to the self. Across the animal world there are moments rare, uneven, debated when a creature seems to cross some version of the same threshold. A body meets an image. The image behaves in synchrony. Something in the observer begins to understand. That possibility matters because it helps define what is ancient in us and what is distinctly human. For a long time, mirror self-recognition has been treated as a kind of cognitive dividing line. A mark is placed on the body where it can only be seen in a mirror. If the animal uses the mirror to inspect or touch the mark on itself rather than responding socially to the image, researchers take that as evidence of self-recognition. Chimpanzees have passed versions of this test. So have bonobos and orangutans in many studies. Dolphins have shown behaviours that suggest a similar awareness. Elephants, in some cases, have done the same. Certain magpies have also entered the discussion, though avian findings remain especially controversial. The evidence is fascinating, but never as clean as people often imagine. Scholars still debate what exactly these tests measure. A creature may understand contingency between its body and the image without possessing anything like human self-concept. Another may fail the test for reasons that have less to do with intelligence than with motivation, anatomy, or lack of interest in marks placed on the skin. Dogs, for example, rely far more heavily on scent than sight and do poorly in conventional mirror tests. Yet this does not mean they lack all self-awareness. The evidence remains incomplete because selfhood is not a single switch that flips on or off. It is a layered set of capacities, and the mirror captures only one of them. Even so, the pattern is revealing. Among the animals most likely to show some degree of mirror self-recognition, many are socially complex, long-lived, and capable of flexible learning. Great apes track alliances, memory, and intention. Dolphins live in intricate social networks and navigate a world through highly specialized perception. Elephants remember places, individuals, and losses across vast spans of time and space. These are not simple minds. They are minds in which body, memory, and social awareness already run deep. Reflection enters where a certain richness of cognition already exists. In that sense, the human story is not an exception so much as an expansion. The first thing that reflection reveals is not that humans alone can recognize correspondence between body and image, but that we belong to a wider evolutionary pattern in which some minds become able to model themselves from the outside. What makes humans different is what happens next. We do not stop at recognition. We build systems around it. We decorate ourselves for the reflected gaze. We tie reflections to identity, beauty, morality, performance, rank, shame, ritual, and philosophy. We make mirrors portable. We make them precise. We turn them into everyday tools and symbols of power. No other species does that. Still, watching how animals respond to their own image helps recover something about the likely prehistoric human experience. Many animals initially treat a reflection as another being. They display, investigate, threaten, avoid, or attempt contact. The image appears social before it appears self-referential. This is exactly the kind of progression that may once have characterized human encounters as well. A face in water first attracts attention because it looks alive. It becomes self only after repeated synchrony overcomes the instinct to treat it as other. There is a useful humility in that comparison. It reminds us that self-recognition is not a mystical human essence descending all at once. It is a problem of perception, memory, and inference, rooted in biology as much as culture. The reflected image offers a puzzle. Different nervous systems solve different parts of it in different ways. Humans solve it with unusual depth because we bring language, symbolism, and cumulative culture to the scene. But the first stage, the startled awareness that the image moves with the body, is shared more widely than older ideas of human exceptionalism allowed. At the same time, the comparison reveals the limits of the mirror as an index of mind. A gorilla may avoid direct gaze because, in gorilla social behavior, staring can signal threat, making mirror responses less straightforward than in chimpanzees. A dog may ignore visual marks while still possessing a rich awareness of its own body through smell and action. A human infant may not yet recognize its reflected face while already forming attachments, expectations, and social understanding of great subtlety. The mirror, then, is not a final test of consciousness. It is a narrow but powerful window onto one particular feature of self-relation, the ability to identify an external visual double as one's own embodied presence. What survives in the broader scientific record suggests that humans take that feature and place extraordinary pressure on it. Once a reflected self is known, it becomes inseparable from social life. A face can be inspected before entering a gathering, ornament can be adjusted, expressions can be rehearsed, damage can be assessed, aging can be watched. The self becomes available for modification and scrutiny in a way few other creatures ever experience. This likely intensifies already existing social sensitivities. A species that depends heavily on being read by others gains a new ability to read itself in advance. There is also a strange emotional kinship between humans and animals at reflective surfaces. Birds striking windows, cats pawing at mirrors, deer pausing before still water, apes inspecting glass. These scenes carry a familiar tension. Something is present but unreachable. Vision says one thing, touch another. The image is convincing enough to matter, but empty enough to confuse. That tension may help explain why reflected selves retain a slight uncanniness even after full recognition. The phenomenon never becomes wholly ordinary because it always contains a contradiction at its core. The body is here, the body is also there. Both are true and neither is simple. No single explanation fully accounts for why humans turned this contradiction into such dense culture. One possibility is that our social dependence made appearance especially consequential. Another is that our symbolic capacity encouraged us to invest doubles, surfaces, and correspondences with meaning. Another is that language allowed us to share and elaborate these experiences until they became woven into tradition. Most likely all of these are involved. The animal comparison helps by stripping the question down to basics. Recognition itself may be ancient and biologically grounded. The avalanche of meaning built upon it is where human distinctiveness appears. A lesser-known detail in this debate concerns species that fail mirror tests, but excel at other forms of bodily self-awareness. Some animals navigate tight spaces by compensating for their own body size with impressive accuracy. Others recognize their own calls, scents, or movement signatures. This suggests that selfhood can be distributed across senses and tasks, rather than concentrated in visual recognition. That matters for prehistory because it reminds us that early humans already know themselves in many ways before reflection becomes significant. They know their strength, reach, pain, voice, smell, gait, and position in the group. Reflection does not invent selfhood from nothing. It privileges the visual channel and makes the face newly central to self-knowledge. That centrality may be one reason the human path diverges so sharply. Vision is already crucial in human social life. We read faces, gestures, body orientation, and gaze with unusual care. Once vision turns back onto the self, an enormous feedback loop begins. The self can be seen, altered, judged, remembered, and compared. From there, it is only a long cultural unfolding, not an immediate leap, but a real one to cosmetics, masks, portraiture, grooming codes, elite mirrors, sacred doubles, and eventually the endless modern traffic of images in which people monitor and reproduce their own faces constantly. The animal at the edge of the mirror and the human at the edge of the pool therefore stand close together for a moment, then part ways. Both confront a visual double. Both may test it. Both may, in certain cases, understand that the body and image are linked. but only one species goes on to organize so much of its symbolic and social world around that fact. The water does not just show humans a face, it gives them a new medium for selfhood, one that culture will spend millennia deepening. Scholars still debate where exactly to draw the line between recognition and richer self-awareness, and the evidence remains incomplete on many animal cases. That uncertainty is useful. It keeps the story grounded. It prevents the old temptation to turn reflection into a simple badge of superiority. The more careful view is also the more interesting one. Humans are continuous with the animal world in our capacities for perception, contingency learning, and embodied awareness. What is distinctive is not that we alone can meet an image and feel its pull, but that we transform that encounter into artifice, ritual, hierarchy, and introspection. So when the human face first stabilizes in water, it does not enter an empty category. It joins a deeper evolutionary history in which some minds can, under the right conditions, notice themselves from the outside. Yet in human hands and human thought that capacity begins to grow wild. It becomes more than recognition. It becomes interpretation. And once interpretation begins, the reflected self is no longer just another creature at the edge of the pool. It is the beginning of a long and complicated relationship with being seen. Once a reflection becomes understandable, it does not remain only a curiosity. Human beings are rarely content to leave a powerful perception unused. We turn it over, repeat it, embed it in habits, and gradually pull it into systems of meaning far larger than the moment that first revealed it. The face in still water may begin as a quiet discovery, but over time it becomes entangled with some of the oldest human practices: washing, grooming, painting, ornamenting, mourning, initiation, seduction, rank, and the uneasy management of how a body appears before other eyes. This shift does not require a perfectly clear mirror. Even a rough and unstable reflection can be enough to alter behavior. A person who has learned that water can show a face may begin to use sheltered pools more deliberately. Not every time, and not everywhere, but often enough for a new habit to take shape. Body paint can be checked, at least in broad placement. Hair can be smoothed. A wound can be examined. Ash, blood, or dust can be noticed on the skin. The information is incomplete. The image unreliable, but it is still information that previously belonged mostly to the judgment of others. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that concern with the visible body is extremely old. Pigments such as red ochre appear again and again in prehistoric contexts, sometimes associated with burials, sometimes with habitation areas, sometimes with objects clearly handled and processed for use. Shell beads, pierced teeth, bone pendants, bracelets, and other adornments emerge across widely separated regions and time periods. These are not accidents. They indicate repeated investment in display, distinction, memory, and social identity. People are making themselves visible to one another in deliberate ways long before formal mirrors become common. Scholars still debate the exact meanings of these practices. A bead may mark age, kinship, status, beauty, ritual role, or group belonging. Red pigment may serve aesthetic, symbolic, protective, or funerary purposes, sometimes several at once. The evidence remains incomplete because material traces rarely arrive with explanation attached. But no single explanation fully accounts for the persistence of body modification across so much of human prehistory. What seems clear is that the human body is not treated as a neutral surface. It becomes a place where society is written. Reflection, once understood, gives that writing a new kind of feedback. A painted body no longer depends only on touch and the reactions of companions. It can, under certain conditions, be partially inspected by the person wearing it. This may strengthen the precision of some practices, but more importantly, it changes their psychological character. The wearer is no longer only the object of adornment, they become its observer too. The image in water confirms that ornament has visible effect. A shell at the throat catches light. Pigment darkens the eye area. Braided hair changes the outline of the head. The self begins to participate in its own visual construction. There is a quiet revolution in that. Many animals display themselves, but humans increasingly curate themselves. We do not only grow features or bear markings, we add, remove, arrange, and revise them. Reflection likely does not cause that tendency. Since adornment is older than any evidence for manufactured mirrors, but it may accelerate it by making visible consequences easier to grasp. Once a person can see even a rough likeness, appearance becomes something that can be adjusted in relation to an internal intention. That is a new level of bodily authorship. The ritual dimension may be just as important as the practical one. In many traditional societies, changes to the body are not matters of everyday vanity, but moments of transformation. Initiation markings, mourning paint, marriage adornment, war preparation, healing treatments, and sacred costumes all alter how a person appears at precisely the points when identity itself is changing. A reflection in such moments would not be trivial. It would show not only a face, but a new state. It would reveal passage. The person at the water's edge would see themselves altered into another social form. The evidence remains incomplete on how early this kind of reflective ritual awareness emerges, but the connection is plausible. Humans repeatedly tie bodily surfaces to thresholds in life birth, adulthood, fertility, battle, sickness, death. Water is also repeatedly tied to thresholds purification, danger, crossing, renewal, access to the unseen. When body alteration and reflective surfaces meet, the result is powerful even in later historical periods. It would be surprising if this resonance had no deep roots at all. There is also the matter of rank. Ornament is often social before it is personal. It signals who belongs, who leads, who has endured, who has access to rare materials, who may approach or command. In small-scale societies, visible difference matters because social life is close, direct, and continuous. A necklace of shells from a distant coast, a distinctive arrangement of feathers, a rare pigment, or the polished shine of carefully worked stone may carry messages understood immediately by the group. Reflection allows some of those messages to be checked from within. A leader or ritual specialist may begin to see what others see, even if only imperfectly. This is the point where reflection starts edging toward power, not yet in the form of royal mirrors or priestly instruments, but in the simpler form of bodily control. The ability to inspect one's own appearance, however roughly, gives a person a different relation to presentation. It allows intentionality to move outward onto the face and body with greater confidence. Over time, that can deepen hierarchies because those with more access to reflective surfaces, better materials, or calmer ritual settings gain greater command over visible identity. Yet the earliest reflective practices may remain deeply communal. Grooming in human societies is often social, not private. Hair is arranged by others, pigment is applied by others, scars, tattoos, and adornments are bestowed, supervised, or witnessed. Reflection enters this world not as a replacement for collective shaping, but as an addition to it. A person may prepare themselves with help, then lean over water to inspect the result, or a group may gather around a calm surface together. Commenting, laughing, confirming, teaching, the self is seen but never outside society. That social setting may also soften the unsettling aspect of reflection. A solitary face in dark water can feel uncanny, almost disembodied. A face encountered during shared preparation for ritual or celebration may feel stabilizing instead. The image becomes part of a recognized process. Children watching adults paint themselves before a ceremony, hunters washing and checking their appearance before departure, mourners seeing ash or red ochre on their faces after a death. These are all settings where reflection could become woven into collective emotion rather than private disturbance. A lesser-known but important point is that adornment often changes the face more than the body. Necklaces and clothing matter, but pigment around the eyes, scars on the cheeks, hair arrangements, and forehead ornaments directly transform the part of the self that reflection reveals most strongly. This may create a feedback loop. Once humans can observe facial alteration, the face becomes an even more active site of meaning. It is already central in social communication. Now it becomes more explicitly central in self-fashioning too. No single explanation fully accounts for why some body practices become sacred while others remain ordinary. The same red pigment can be decorative in one context, funerary in another, protective in a third. The same reflective pool can serve washing one morning and ritual preparation the next. Human meaning is layered like that, but reflection likely contributes to the layering because it intensifies awareness. A painted face seen in one's own image does not feel exactly the same as paint applied without any chance of inspection. The visible self becomes part of the experience. From there, the boundary between grooming and ritual grows thin. Combing hair, washing the face, smoothing pigment, adjusting ornaments. These can be practical acts and sacred acts at once. The body is cleaned, but also prepared. The appearance is altered, but also authorized. Reflection participates in both levels. It helps the body become socially legible and emotionally real. One can see that the change has happened. One can see that one is ready, or marked, or transformed. This may be where the reflected self begins to gather emotion beyond simple recognition. Not only that is me, but that is me changed. A grieving person sees a face dusted with ash. A young initiate sees markings that separate childhood from adulthood. A hunter sees war paint or protective pigment before stepping into danger. The image confirms identity, but it also confirms transition. It gives human beings a way to witness themselves in the act of becoming socially different. What survives in the human record suggests that we are peculiarly drawn to such acts of self-witnessing. We do not merely change, we want, often, to know that we have changed and to see the signs of it. Reflection serves that desire with remarkable economy. It requires no audience and yet preserves the logic of audience. It lets a person behold themselves as others might, at least partially. And in doing so it draws the self deeper into the world of symbols, roles, and managed appearances. So the face in water begins to move outward into culture, not all at once, and not in a straight line, but steadily. A useful image becomes a meaningful image. A meaningful image becomes part of preparation, ceremony, display, and memory. The human body, already a canvas for social life, gains a new witness in the reflective surface, and from that point on, the path toward crafted mirrors, status objects, and sacred doubles becomes easier to imagine. Because the habit behind them has already begun the habit of looking at oneself not merely to know, but to become. At some point, human beings stop waiting for the world to provide a reflection and begin trying to hold one in the hand. That change is easy to overlook because it arrives gradually, through materials already valued for other reasons. A dark stone may first be prized because it cuts well. A polished surface may first be admired because it gleams. Metal may first be hammered for ornament, status, or ritual display. Yet once a surface can reliably return even part of a face, it crosses into a different category. It becomes more than useful material. It becomes an object that can carry the self. The earliest crafted mirrors are not perfect by any modern standard. They're dim, small, often dark, and usually capable of showing only a limited image. But that limitation should not obscure their importance. A poor mirror still changes human experience if it can be carried, controlled, and consulted when needed. Natural reflections depend on weather, light, and place. A made reflective surface begins to break that dependence. It brings self-seeing out of the landscape and into human craft. Among the earliest known examples are polished obsidian mirrors from Anatolia, especially at sites such as Çatalhöyük, dating back roughly 9,000 years. Obsidian, volcanic glass formed by rapid cooling, is already one of the most striking materials in the prehistoric world. It is sharp enough for blades, visually deep, dark as pooled shadow, and capable, when polished, of returning an image with surprising clarity. At Çatalhöyük, where houses crowd together without streets in the modern sense and walls are entered from above, obsidian appears in tools, exchange networks, and objects whose meanings likely extend beyond utility. A polished obsidian mirror in such a place is not just a practical device. It is a deliberate act of surface control. Scholars still debate exactly how these early mirrors were used. Some may have served personal grooming, others may have held ritual significance, some may have circulated as prestige items, rare enough to signal access to distant materials and skilled workmanship. The evidence remains incomplete because an object can pass through many meanings across its life. A mirror may be practical in one setting, ceremonial in another, funerary in a third. No single explanation fully accounts for all archaeological examples, and it is likely that mirrors mean different things in different societies from the beginning. What matters is that people are now investing labour in making reflective surfaces intentionally. That requires both skill and desire. Obsidian must be shaped and polished with care. Stone mirrors made from slate, pyrite, hematite, or other reflective minerals demand abrasion, patience, and an eye for surface quality. Later metal mirrors, often of copper or bronze, require more than polishing alone. They belong to worlds of extraction, hammering, alloying, trade, and elite control. Reflection is no longer a lucky accident found at dawn beside still water. It becomes something produced. This production marks a subtle but decisive shift in the history of the self. A natural reflection is encountered. A crafted mirror is possessed. That difference changes the rhythm of self-awareness. One need not travel to a spring, wait for calm weather, or lean over dark water. The reflective surface can be brought indoors, passed between hands, consulted in secrecy, or displayed publicly. It can become part of ordinary routines or guarded rituals. The self is not only seen, it is now accessible on demand, at least for those who own the object. That last condition matters. Mirrors do not immediately become common household items. For long stretches of history, they are rare, expensive, and bound up with status. The earliest metal mirrors in places like ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus region, and early china are often associated with skilled craft, exchange systems, and in many cases burial assemblages that suggest social significance. A polished copper disc with a handle is not the sort of thing everyone casually possesses. Its making requires resources and knowledge concentrated unevenly in society. Reflection, once manufactured, begins to sort itself along lines of privilege. Yet even before such hierarchies sharpen, the crafted mirror changes something fundamental. It stabilizes the image. Obsidian still darkens and distorts. Metal tarnishes and must be repolished. The face remains dimmer and smaller than in modern glass. But the experience is repeatable. A person can return to the same surface and expect a broadly similar result. The mind no longer has to wrestle with the unpredictability of natural water. Reflection becomes a more dependable form of knowledge. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that this dependability matters not only for grooming, but for the symbolic life of the object itself. Many ancient mirrors are beautiful even when not in use. They gleam. They have shaped handles, decorated backs, carefully chosen materials. Some are buried with the dead. Some appear in ritual or elite settings. In Mesoamerica, polished iron ore and pyrite mirrors later acquire associations with divination, power, and portals of vision. In Bronze Age and early historic societies across Eurasia, mirrors circulate not merely as tools but as charged possessions. This pattern suggests that once reflection is stabilized and portable, it becomes easier to surround it with meaning. There is a lesser-known irony here. The more humans succeed in making mirrors, the less mysterious the mechanics of reflection may become, but the more socially potent mirrors often grow. Familiarity does not cancel aura. In some cases, it strengthens it. A rare object that reveals the face with unusual clarity can be both practical and uncanny, admired for craftsmanship and feared for what it seems to disclose. A dark polished stone that catches a face out of shadow is no less suggestive than still water. It is more controlled, more concentrated, and perhaps therefore more powerful. The making of mirrors also reveals something about human patience with surfaces. To polish stone or metal to reflectivity is to commit to a task whose value is largely visual. This matters in prehistory because it speaks to intention. One does not stumble into a mirror the way one stumbles upon a calm pool. One creates it through repeated abrasion, refinement, and judgment about finish. That implies that people already know, before the object is complete, what kind of result they are seeking. They have seen enough reflections to imagine carrying one in material form. This is one of the strongest signs that the reflected self has become culturally important. A community does not devote labour to manufacturing reflective objects unless reflection has already proved desirable in some practical, symbolic, or social sense. The crafted mirror is therefore not the beginning of human self-seeing, but the material proof that the older, rarer experiences of seeing oneself have accumulated enough significance to justify technological effort. Different regions solve this problem differently. In some places, volcanic glass provides the path. In others, dark polished stone. Elsewhere, hammered copper and later bronze. The details vary with geology, metallurgy, and exchange networks. But the underlying impulse is strikingly consistent. Humans want surfaces that answer with an image. They want to hold still what nature provides only intermittently. They want the face to become retrievable. No single explanation fully accounts for all the uses that follow. Grooming is obvious, but too narrow. Mirrors may help with cosmetic preparation, but they also support costume, rank display, healing observation, ritual transformation, and perhaps forms of divination. in which the reflected surface becomes a threshold rather than a likeness. A mirror can show a face, but it can also show candlelight, sky, flame, and shadow. It can frame reality into a controlled plane. That alone gives it unusual symbolic flexibility. And because mirrors become objects, they also become gifts, inheritances, trade goods, and funerary items. They enter relationships. An obsidian mirror carried across distance contains not just a reflective surface, but a chain of labor, exchange, and value. A copper mirror in a burial suggests that reflection belongs somehow to status, identity, or passage into death. The evidence remains incomplete on any single case, but across time the pattern is unmistakable once made. Mirrors travel far beyond the act of looking. There is also an intimate human consequence. A portable reflective object allows repeated solitary encounter with the face. That is new. Water reflections are often public or environmental, tied to place and circumstance. A crafted mirror can be used in enclosed rooms, private corners, before ceremonies, during illness, or in the quiet moments of personal inspection that archaeology almost never records directly. The self, once dependent on the world to appear, can now be summoned by the hand. From that point on, the path opens toward all later mirror cultures: polished bronze in ancient palaces, lacquered backs in elite tombs, ornate handles, trade in vanity objects, ritual discs, burial mirrors, cosmetic kits, royal treasuries. But at this stage, the essential change has already happened. Humans have crossed from encountering reflections to manufacturing them. They have turned an environmental event into a crafted technology, and that may be one of the most revealing things about our species. We do not merely notice a strange and meaningful phenomenon, we learn how to keep it. We shape matter until it preserves what once flickered only in dawn pools and cave water. A face that was once visible only through patience and luck now begins to travel on stone and metal through settlements, across trade routes, into shrines, houses, and graves. The first mirrors are small, dim, and imperfect, yet in their dark surfaces, human beings accomplish something enormous. They make the visible self portable. Once reflective surfaces can be made, they do not remain neutral for long. Useful objects rarely do. In human societies, anything rare, technically demanding, and visually arresting tends to drift toward concentration in the hands of people who already possess unusual authority. Mirrors follow that pattern with remarkable consistency. They begin as difficult things, dark stones polished with care, metal discs hammered and burnished to a demanding finish, objects that require time, skill, and access to valued materials. That alone makes them scarce. Scarcity then makes them social. The face they return may be anyone's, but the power to consult that face begins to belong to some more than others. In early settled societies, appearance matters in new ways because life itself is changing scale. Villages become towns, towns become cities, authority becomes more formal, labor more specialized, ritual more elaborate, exchange more far-reaching. In such worlds, visible distinction becomes increasingly important. Clothing, jewelry, pigment, hairstyle, headdress, and bodily bearing help organize the social field. They tell people who is sacred, who commands, who serves, who belongs to a certain lineage, office, or profession. Reflection enters this system not simply as convenience, but as a tool for maintaining difference. A polished metal mirror in ancient Egypt, for example, is not merely a bathroom object in some familiar modern sense. It appears in worlds of cosmetics, oils, coal, wigs, linen, ceremony, and carefully managed presentation. Elite burials include mirrors among personal goods, and some mirror handles are fashioned with aesthetic and symbolic care, shaped into forms that connect beauty, status, and divine association. Scholars still debate the exact range of meanings carried by individual objects, and the evidence remains incomplete in many cases. But no single explanation fully accounts for why mirrors recur so persistently in contexts of refinement, adornment, and prestige. They are tools of appearance, but they are also signs that appearance itself has become politically and spiritually consequential. The same is true elsewhere in different forms: in Mesopotamia, in the Indus world, in ancient China, in later Mediterranean societies. Reflective objects circulate through households and burials unevenly, often clustering around those with greater resources or ritual significance. This does not mean mirrors are always restricted to kings and priests alone. Social life is more varied than that. But it does suggest that the ability to inspect and regulate one's own visible presence becomes entangled with hierarchy early on. Those who govern appearances often help govern people. There is practical logic behind this. Authority depends partly on being seen in the right way. A ritual specialist must look transformed enough to mark separation from ordinary life. A ruler must appear composed, adorned, and set apart. A bride, a mourner, a warrior, a healer, all may need visible signs that their role is real. In each case, reflection offers a means of calibration. Paint can be corrected, hair can be arranged, jewelry can be centered. The body becomes a surface for controlled messaging, and the mirror becomes part of the apparatus that stabilizes the message before it reaches others. What survives in the broader historical record suggests that elites often monopolize not only precious materials, but technologies of self-presentation, fine textiles, imported pigments, rare perfumes, carved cosmetic containers, and polished mirrors clustered together because they all serve a related purpose. They help shape how persons of rank appear before those around them. That appearance is not superficial in the dismissive modern sense. It is one of the ways power becomes believable. A person who looks unlike everyone else, who seems composed by rare materials and careful surfaces, is easier to imagine as set apart by cosmic order, ancestry, or divine favor. Mirrors intensify this because they create a loop between authority and self-observation. A leader can monitor the very image others are meant to receive. This does not guarantee effective rule, of course, but it does support theatrical control. Courtly life in many historical societies grows increasingly invested in posture, gesture, facial composure, and ornament. Reflection becomes one of the quiet tools behind that choreography. The face ceases to be merely lived, it is managed. There is also the deeper mystery of secrecy. A mirror can be consulted alone. That matters. Much of public power is prepared in private cosmetics applied before ceremony, regalia adjusted before appearance, expressions gathered into composure before judgment or performance. A reflective surface allows someone to rehearse themselves away from the crowd. In that sense, mirrors are not only devices of vanity or ornament, but instruments for manufacturing the public self in seclusion. Archaeology rarely captures these intimate scenes directly, yet the objects imply them. Somewhere, in a chamber or courtyard, someone looks closely and prepares to be seen. Scholars still debate how early mirrors become associated with ritual specialists in a strong sense, but the association is widespread enough to notice. A reflective surface does more than show the face. It frames it, isolates it, and can surround it with shadows or gleam depending on material and light. A polished bronze mirror catching torchlight or a dark obsidian disc returning a face out of darkness does not feel entirely mundane. Especially in societies where the boundaries between visible and invisible worlds are already thick with meaning. A priest or diviner holding such an object possesses not only a tool, but a stage for controlled revelation. This is one reason mirrors begin to overlap with power even when their optical quality remains modest. A modern person might undervalue a dim or slightly distorted image, but ancient mirrors are experienced differently because the context is different. Precision is only part of their force. Their force also lies in exclusivity, brightness, polish, rarity, and the uncanny fact that a shaped object can hold a living face. To own such a surface is to own a portable encounter with the self, and perhaps with other things as well. The evidence remains incomplete on how ordinary people experience mirrors in many early societies, yet inequality in access is unmistakable. This likely affects psychology over time. A world in which only some people routinely inspect themselves is not the same as one in which everyone does. Self-awareness becomes stratified in subtle ways. Those with mirrors can monitor aging, appearance, and social signals more closely. They can cultivate poise and presentation with more regularity. They may also become more invested in ideals of beauty or decorum that others must approximate through communal assistance rather than direct self-observation. A lesser-known consequence may be the strengthening of expert labour around the face and body. Once appearance can be inspected more reliably, specialisation becomes more useful. Hairdressers, cosmetic attendants, metal polishers, ornament makers, textile arrangers, whether formally named or not, gain more important roles in helping others achieve visible effects. Mirrors do not create specialization, but they likely increase the precision and repeatability of aesthetic labor. The body becomes a project with measurable visual outcomes. No single explanation fully accounts for why reflections so often gather around both beauty and authority. Yet the connection is not hard to see. Beauty, in hierarchical societies, is rarely just private preference. It becomes coded with class, purity, fertility, discipline, even divine favor. A well-maintained face can signal access to time, care, and rare substances. A ruler's image can embody the order of the state. A priest's transformed appearance can make the invisible seem socially present. The mirror becomes the quiet accomplice of all these effects. And still, beneath the politics of surface, the old uncanniness remains. Power does not eliminate it. In some ways it sharpens it. The more a society invests reflection with significance, the easier it becomes for mirrors to feel dangerous as well as useful. A dark, polished object that reveals the face can also seem capable of revealing too much weakness. Age, impurity, hidden intention, or the instability beneath ceremonial composure. To face oneself closely is not always comforting. Those who must appear most controlled may feel this most sharply. What survives across cultures suggests that control of appearance is never trivial, because appearance mediates between body and society. A person cannot choose how others interpret every sign, but they can try to shape the signs. Mirrors extend that attempt. They allow correction before exposure, arrangement before judgment, artistry before encounter. In hands already close to power, this becomes one more means of separating the elevated from the ordinary. So by the time crafted mirrors are established in human life, reflection has moved far from the accidental pool at dawn. It now stands inside houses, tombs, shrines, and elite chambers, It accompanies cosmetics, costume, ritual, and rank. It helps produce faces that are meant to command trust, desire, awe, or obedience. The image returned is still a face, still a self, but its context has changed. It is no longer only about recognition, it is about control. And that may be one of the most enduring human developments hidden inside the history of mirrors. Once we can see ourselves reliably, we do not merely understand ourselves better, we begin to stage ourselves. We turn the visible self into something that can be edited, composed, and deployed. In ordinary life, that may mean a smoothed hairstyle or straightened ornament. In the lives of elites and ritual specialists, it can mean something much larger. The transformation of reflection into an instrument of authority, where the power to look right becomes inseparable from the power to rule, to persuade, and to seem more than merely human. Long after humans understand that a reflection belongs to the body standing before it, many of them continue to feel that it belongs to something else as well. This is one of the strangest consistencies in human culture. The reflected face can be recognized as self and still remain unstable in meaning. It is too exact to dismiss, too intangible to trust completely. It appears with total obedience, yet without substance. It can vanish in an instant. It can be broken, dimmed, distorted, interrupted. A mirror does not simply show the body, it produces a double, and doubles have always unsettled the human imagination. This helps explain why reflections so often become entangled with ideas of soul, spirit, breath, fate, death, and hidden identity. The connection is not universal in identical form, and scholars still debate how far back particular beliefs can be traced. The evidence remains incomplete, especially for deep prehistory, where inner life must be inferred from objects, spaces, and later analogies rather than direct testimony. Yet across recorded history the pattern is difficult to ignore. Human beings repeatedly treat the reflected self as something more than surface. It can be vulnerable, it can be dangerous, it can be revelatory, it can be taken, trapped, broken, or transformed. Part of this likely comes from the structure of the experience itself. A reflection is the self, and not the self at once. It resembles the body perfectly enough to compel recognition, but it lives in another space. In water it appears below, as though inhabiting depth. In polished stone it emerges from darkness. In metal it flickers depending on angle and light, there one moment and gone the next. This is not how ordinary objects behave. A handprint remains on rock. A carved figure stays where it is made. A shadow at least follows a logic of light and ground that can be roughly predicted. But a reflection carries the eerie intimacy of the body without any of the body's material continuity. In many cultures, that instability attracts metaphysical interpretation almost automatically. The face seen in a reflective surface is imagined as a second self, a life image, a visible trace of something deeper than flesh. The details vary widely. Some traditions connect mirrors and water to divination, as if the surface can reveal truths not otherwise accessible. Others treat reflections as vulnerable extensions of the person, making damage to the image or misuse of the mirror symbolically dangerous. Others associate the reflected face with death, perhaps because the image is present and absent at once, lifelike and bodiless, immediate and untouchable. No single explanation fully accounts for the diversity of these beliefs, but the sensory logic underneath them is strong. Water is especially potent in this regard. A face seen in still water seems to rise from below the world of ordinary footing. Depth darkens it, Ripples deform it. The image appears alive, then collapses into abstraction. This lends itself easily to association with underworlds, ancestors, spirits, or hidden realms beneath the surface of things. It would be reckless to map later myths directly onto early human experience, yet the repeated convergence of water, reflection, and otherworldly thinking suggests that the psychology is ancient. A human being looking into dark water confronts not just likeness, but a version of the self already translated into strangeness. Crafted mirrors do not remove that strangeness. In some ways they intensify it. A polished obsidian disc or bronze mirror is an object deliberately made to hold the face, and that very fact can make it feel charged. What kind of thing is this, that it contains a person without containing them? What survives in the archaeological and historical record suggests that mirrors often move beyond grooming into ritual use, precisely because they stabilize this uncanny property. They do not merely reflect, they preserve the possibility of threshold experience in a portable form. Ancient China offers one striking example of how reflection becomes morally and cosmologically suggestive. Bronze mirrors, there are not only practical items but objects of artistry, inscription, and symbolism. Later traditions develop the idea of the mirror as something that can reveal truth, repel evil, or clarify hidden reality. In some philosophical writing, the mind itself is compared to a mirror that should be polished, cleansed, or kept clear. The mirror becomes a moral technology by analogy, a surface that reflects things as they are, unless clouded. The specific forms of these ideas are historically situated, but they illustrate a broader pattern. Reflections invite people to think that appearance can expose what lies beneath appearance. In the Mediterranean world too, mirrors move in and out of tension between vanity, eroticism, prophecy, danger, and death. They accompany grooming and adornment, but also mythic warning. The same object that allows a face to be prepared can suggest self-absorption, illusion, or revelation. In Mesoamerica, polished mirrors of pyrite and iron ore become strongly associated with divine power, vision, rulership, and the ability to see beyond ordinary human limits. These are not minor cultural coincidences. They suggest that once reflective surfaces become socially visible, people again and again treat them as more than tools. There is also the frequent belief that reflections can be harmed or lost. Across various traditions, covering mirrors after death, fearing broken mirrors, avoiding certain reflective encounters at liminal times, or restricting who may look and when all point toward a persistent idea. The image is bound to the person in a way that is not entirely trivial. Even where people understand the mechanics of reflection perfectly well, symbolic danger remains. The evidence remains incomplete for the origin of these customs, and many are historically recent in their exact form, but their recurrence reveals something deep in the way humans experience doubles. We know the reflection is not literally the soul, yet culturally we continue to treat it as though it touches a vulnerable boundary of the self. This boundary becomes especially important around death. A corpse still has a face, but no longer returns a gaze, expression, or movement. A reflection, by contrast, preserves the living face only so long as the living body stands before it. It is a temporary life image. That may be one reason reflective surfaces are so easily drawn toward funerary symbolism. A mirror can accompany the dead because it once held the living presence that is now gone. Or it can be covered after death because the relationship between image and life has become unstable. Scholars still debate the meanings of mirror deposits in graves across different cultures, but what survives in the record suggests that people repeatedly place reflection near mortality. There is a lesser-known psychological dimension to this. Humans are especially sensitive to slight irregularities in faces and movements. A distorted reflection therefore carries unusual force. A face in moving water, a dim image in metal, a warped surface, a flicker in firelight. These do not merely alter appearance, they create near selves. They're close enough to identity to feel intimate, but altered enough to feel significant. This may help explain why mirrors become linked not only to truth, but to deception and hidden forces. A surface can show the face, but it can also betray it, age it, distort it, or seem to reveal something that ordinary perception does not. No single explanation fully accounts for why some societies emphasize soul, others truth, others danger, others beauty, others prophecy. Human symbolic life is too varied for that. But all these meanings fit within the same broad structure. Reflection offers the self as an image detached from the body, and human beings are unusually unwilling to leave such a phenomenon uninterpreted. We do not merely see the double, we ask what kind of thing the double is. What survives in the longest arc of culture suggests that the answer is never settled. Even now, in technologically saturated societies, people still speak of mirrors as revealing, exposing, flattering, betraying. They still feel unease in dark windows at night, in distorted elevator steel, in sudden glimpses of their own face from an unexpected angle. Children still find some reflections eerie. Adults still project emotion onto them. That persistence matters because it hints that beneath all the learned symbolism lies a more durable cognitive tension. The self returned by a surface is recognizable, but not fully absorbable. It remains slightly outside ownership. This is why reflections and souls so often meet, not because people are foolish or unaware of optics, but because the reflected self occupies a peculiar place between body and representation. It seems to belong to the person, yet exists in another plane. It mirrors life with extraordinary precision, yet has no flesh, breath, weight, or warmth. It is a person translated into pure appearance. For a species already inclined to imagine hidden layers beneath visible life, that is irresistible material. And so the history of reflection does not move from mystery to pure practicality in a straight line. It moves from mystery to management, and then back into mystery through culture. Mirrors help humans groom, rank, and control appearances, but they also remain openings through which deeper anxieties and hopes gather. They become objects of beauty and fear. They belong in bedrooms and tombs, shrines and dressing rooms, rituals and private doubts. The face they show is one's own, and yet never entirely only one's own. By this point in the story, the first human at the edge of still water is very far away in time, yet still present in structure. The same strangeness remains. A face appears where no face is. It follows every movement. It vanishes if the conditions fail. It feels immediate and unreachable at once. That is enough to produce not just recognition, but metaphysics. And once human beings begin to see the reflected self as something that touches the unseen, the mirror is no longer only an object of sight, it becomes an object of belief. For all the power of this story, there is a hard limit at its centre. No archaeologist will ever excavate the first moment a human recognizes their own reflection. No burial preserves that instant. No cave wall records it plainly. No shard of obsidian carries a sentence saying, "This is when the face in the surface became the self." The beginning of reflected self-recognition belongs to a category of human experience that is enormously important and almost impossible to document directly. It leaves consequences, not testimony. That absence matters because it forces caution. The temptation is always to tell the story as a dramatic turning point, a single dawn beside a still pool, one human face hovering over dark water and suddenly understanding everything. It is a beautiful image, and perhaps something like it did happen countless times, but scholars still debate how best to think about such thresholds because the evidence remains incomplete in a very specific way. We can study reflective materials, symbolic behavior, cognitive development, social complexity, and the environments that make stable reflections likely. What we cannot do is watch prehistory think. This is one of the oldest problems in studying the human mind. Behavior fossilizes unevenly. Bone survives better than belief. Stone tools survive better than memory. Pigment stains, shell beads, carved figures, polished objects, and burial practices all offer clues, but clues are not inner states. A person may wear ochre for ritual reasons, aesthetic reasons, social reasons, or several at once. A polished obsidian surface may be a mirror, a prestige object, a ritual device, or all three. A still pool in a cave may be meaningful, or simply there. The material record gives us traces of action, but rarely final certainty about interpretation. That is why the story of reflection must be built indirectly. One line of evidence comes from cognition. Humans clearly possess the mental capacities needed for self-recognition, and those capacities deepen over long evolutionary time. Another line comes from symbolic culture. By the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, humans are demonstrably investing surfaces, bodies, and objects with representational meaning. Another line comes from material technology. Once reflective surfaces are intentionally polished, the desire to possess and use reflections is no longer in doubt. Another comes from developmental and comparative psychology, which helps show how self-recognition can emerge gradually rather than appearing as an all-or-nothing event. But even when these lines converge, gaps remain. We do not know exactly when most people in most ancient societies first understood natural reflections as self-images. We do not know whether this recognition is common in Homo sapiens from very early on, or whether it varies significantly with culture and environmental exposure. We do not know how Neanderthals, Denisovans, or other archaic humans experienced reflective surfaces, though some possibilities are plausible. We do not know how often reflection carried spiritual weight in prehistory, versus being treated as ordinary practical information. These are not minor uncertainties. They define the subject. What survives in the record suggests that humans are fully capable of rich self-awareness long before crafted mirrors become widespread. Yet that does not settle how often visual self-awareness is exercised in daily life. A person may possess the capacity for reflection, recognition, and still rarely encounter conditions that support it clearly. Geography intervenes, light intervenes, material culture intervenes. This means the story is likely uneven across the ancient world. Some communities may live with frequent access to still reflective water or polished dark stone. Others may not. Some may fold reflection into ritual quickly. Others may treat it casually. The first reflected self is therefore probably not one event, but many local histories layered across deep time. This is also where romantic overreach becomes dangerous. Popular imagination often fills the evidentiary silence with certainty the first mirror changed everything overnight. Ancient people saw souls in every pool. Prehistoric reflections directly gave birth to religion, art, or self-consciousness. These claims are dramatic, but the evidence does not support such simple lines of cause and effect. no single explanation fully accounts for the emergence of self-awareness, symbolism, ritual, or visual culture. Reflection may contribute to all of these, but it's only one part of a much larger human development shaped by language, memory, cooperation, death, kinship, environment, and the long accumulation of cultural practice. The uncertainty becomes even sharper when we ask about feeling. What did the first recognizable reflection feel like? Fear, curiosity, delight, indifference, reverence. The honest answer is that we do not know. Different people almost certainly responded differently. A child shown a face in still water might laugh. An adult alone in a dark cave pool might feel unease. A ritual specialist using a polished surface might experience solemnity. A person checking paint before a ceremony might feel simple concentration. The reflected self is not attached to one universal emotion. It is a perceptual event open to many cultural and personal meanings. There is a lesser-known methodological problem here as well. Researchers often work backward from historical mirror traditions and then imagine earlier stages leading toward them. But later, mirror-rich societies may actually mislead us. People who live among metal, glass, and polished interiors experience reflection constantly. They may overestimate how salient it would be in environments where stable, reflective surfaces are rare. The prehistoric mind may not be less capable, but its visual habits may be organized differently. A face rarely seen by the self may carry different weight than one inspected daily. This is a humbling reminder that ancient perception is not just a less advanced version of ours. It may be structured by a different ecology of surfaces altogether. At the same time, uncertainty should not paralyze the story. It should refine it. Some things are genuinely strong in the evidence. Humans care deeply about appearance very early. Humans become symbol makers and body modifiers long before abundant mirrors. Humans eventually manufacture reflective objects on purpose. Mirrors repeatedly gather ritual and social significance in many unrelated cultures. Children and some animals show that self-recognition can emerge through gradual contingent learning, rather than through verbal instruction alone. Together, these patterns make it entirely reasonable to argue that seeing one's own face has been meaningful to humans for a very long time, even if its earliest meanings can never be pinned down with full precision. Scholars still debate the relationship between self-recognition and personhood, between mirror use and self-consciousness, between visual self-awareness and broader symbolic life. That debate is productive because it prevents the subject from collapsing into myth. The evidence remains incomplete, but incomplete evidence is not empty evidence. It allows us to identify probabilities, environments, cognitive prerequisites, and cultural consequences even when it denies us a single founding scene. In a way, the absence of direct proof is fitting. Reflection itself is an unstable kind of evidence. It is visible but untouchable, present but ungraspable. The history of reflection mirrors the phenomenon it studies. We see enough to know something real is there, but not enough to hold it fully still. The first human reflection survives in anthropology, the way a face survives in disturbed water recognizably, suggestively, and never with complete certainty. What this means for the larger story is important. We're not tracing an invention in the straightforward sense, like pottery or metallurgy, where artifacts can be dated and techniques compared. We are tracing the growth of a relationship between mind, body, and surface. That relationship leaves no clear starting line. It becomes visible only where other evidence intersects with it: art, ornament, polished materials, sacred spaces, burial objects, cognitive models, comparative behavior. We infer the invisible from the visible, knowing all the while that inference has limits. And yet some of the most important things in human history must be approached exactly this way. Language itself leaves no early fossil, emotional worlds leave only traces, kinship rules, myths, gestures, private fears, internal images of the self, all of these have to be reconstructed from fragments, patterns, and analogy. Reflection belongs to that difficult category of profound but perishable experience. It shaped human life not by surviving directly, but by altering what humans made, believed, and noticed afterward. So this section of the story must remain deliberately unresolved. The first human recognition of a reflection is one of those events that almost certainly happened, likely happened many times, and can never be witnessed again. We can describe the conditions that made it possible. We can identify the minds capable of it. We can follow its long consequences into ritual, power, technology, and selfhood. But we cannot name the day, the place, or the person. The record does not give us that. What it gives instead is something quieter and perhaps more interesting, a field of evidence pointing toward a threshold that must have mattered, even though it left no signature of its own. Somewhere in deep time, many somewheres, humans learn to read their own faces in the world. The proof is not a preserved scene. The proof is everything that comes later, once that capacity has entered culture and refuses to leave. Once the limits of the evidence are acknowledged, the question changes. It is no longer only when humans first saw themselves, but when seeing became understanding. That is a much harder problem, because recognition can mean several different things at once. A face may be noticed without being identified. A reflection may be understood as contingent on one's movements, without being folded into a broader concept of self. A person may know that the image is theirs in a practical sense, and still attach to it meanings that make it more than merely optical. This is why competing theories persist. They're not all trying to explain the same threshold. One theory places the decisive change deep in biological evolution. In this view, by the time anatomically modern humans emerge, the underlying cognitive machinery for self-recognition is already in place. The visual system can map movement contingencies. The brain can coordinate bodily sensation with external appearance. Social intelligence is advanced enough to support perspective-taking, reflection, then does not create a new kind of mind. It simply reveals one. Under the right environmental conditions, most humans would be capable of grasping the link between body and image, even if they rarely encounter clear reflective surfaces. The strength of this theory is that it fits what we know about modern cognition and about the sophistication of prehistoric humans in many other domains. A second theory emphasizes culture over biology. It argues that the raw capacity may be ancient, but meaningful self-recognition depends on a social world that teaches people what appearance is, why it matters, and how images can stand for persons. In that view, a reflection becomes fully intelligible only where symbolic culture, language, body ornament, and social categories have already deepened enough to make the face into an object of explicit thought. A human being may notice visual synchrony much earlier, but the reflected self as a concept emerges later, as societies become more invested in visible identity. The strength of this theory is that it explains why the same perceptual event can carry such different weight in different contexts. A third view treats the whole question as gradual and layered rather than tied to any single threshold. It suggests that there is no one moment when humans first understand reflections in the fullest sense. Instead, there are several levels. First comes perceptual contingency. The image moves when I move. Then bodily attribution, the image belongs to this body. Then practical self-use. I can use the reflection to inspect paint, injury, or ornament. Then symbolic elaboration. The image means something about spirit, identity, status, truth, or transformation. This model has a great deal to recommend it because it matches both child development and the archaeological reality that human cultural capacities accumulate unevenly rather than appearing all at once. Scholars still debate which of these frameworks best captures the evidence, and the evidence remains incomplete partly because each theory may be true at a different scale. Biological capacity almost certainly matters. So does cultural framing. So does gradual layering. No single explanation fully accounts for the story because the story includes perception, cognition, emotion, and social meaning all at once. Trying to compress that complexity into one answer is part of what makes the question so slippery. There is also a philosophical theory that pushes the issue in another direction. Some thinkers argue that mirror recognition is not the beginning of selfhood at all, but merely one specialized expression of a self that already exists more deeply through bodily action. In this view, humans know themselves first through movement, agency, and relation to the world. The visual image is secondary, perhaps even somewhat misleading. Reflection becomes significant not because it creates the self, but because it objectifies the self, turning lived experience into an image that can be managed, judged, and alienated. This line of thought is especially useful for understanding why mirrors can be both empowering and unsettling. They do not simply reveal us, they also separate us from ourselves by making us into something seen. That helps explain why different scholars sometimes seem to talk past one another. An archaeologist may be asking when reflective surfaces become materially important. A cognitive scientist may be asking when the brain can map the self visually. A philosopher may be asking when the self becomes an object to itself. An anthropologist may be asking when reflection enters ritual and social meaning. These are related questions, but not identical ones. A person can pass from one threshold to another over an entire lifetime. A culture can do the same over thousands of years. The debate becomes even more interesting when archaic humans are brought back into view. If Neanderthals cared for the injured, used pigments, buried some of their dead, and handled complex tools and landscapes with great intelligence, is it reasonable to assume that they could recognize themselves in still water or polished stone? Many researchers would say yes, or at least yes as a plausible possibility. Others remain cautious, arguing that symbolic complexity and visual self-modeling may not align so neatly. The evidence remains incomplete because the behaviors that would settle the question do not fossilize cleanly. Yet the discussion itself is revealing. It shows how far the old picture of a sudden modern human mental revolution has weakened. The threshold of reflection, like so many human thresholds, may have older and broader roots than once believed. A lesser-known angle comes from environments of scarcity and abundance. Some theorists suggest that recognizing a reflection and caring deeply about one's reflected appearance are separate matters. In landscapes where reflective surfaces are rare, the capacity may exist but remain only occasionally exercised. In societies with abundant polished surfaces, the same capacity may become socially amplified until appearance takes on vastly greater personal and political importance. This would mean that the first recognition question can never be divorced from material conditions. Minds do not operate in empty space. They are trained by the surfaces they encounter regularly. What survives in the historical record supports that possibility. Once mirrors become more widespread, they do not merely reveal a pre-existing stable self. They participate in shaping new forms of self-consciousness. People inspect themselves more often. They refine appearance more precisely. They learn their own faces from repeated angles and conditions. They compare themselves not only to memory and to others, but to a steady stream of self-images over long periods. This likely intensifies introspection and social comparison. If so, the reflected self is not just discovered once in deep time, it is reconfigured repeatedly as technologies of reflection improve. This has led some modern scholars to argue that the most transformative first may not be the first natural reflection at all, but the first reliable mirror, or even the first society saturated with reflective media. There is truth in that, but only up to a point. Without the older experience of seeing the self in water, stone, and metal, later mirror cultures would have no cognitive foothold. The portable mirror matters because the mind already knows what a reflection is. The more recent revolutions intensify an older human relationship rather than inventing it from nothing. Another theory worth noting is the social self model. This view suggests that humans first understand reflections not in isolation, but because they already imagine themselves from the perspective of others. The self is socially mirrored before it is visually mirrored. Long before a person sees their own face, they know that others respond to them as a visible being. They feel approval, shame, attraction, irritation, fear, attention. A reflection becomes meaningful because it slots into this pre-existing structure of social evaluation. One does not merely see a face, one sees the face others have always been responding to. That theory is compelling because it links reflection to the intensely social character of human cognition. No single explanation fully accounts for every part of the evidence, yet together these theories produce a richer answer than any simple origin story could. Humans likely possess the biological capacity for reflection recognition deep in our past. That capacity becomes meaningful through symbolic culture, social life, and repeated exposure. It is exercised unevenly depending on environment and material technology. It develops in layers, from perception to use to interpretation, and it may intensify forms of self-objectification that become central to later human life. This layered view also preserves a valuable uncertainty. It allows for the possibility that many ancient humans understand reflections in practical ways without surrounding them with large metaphysical significance. It also allows for the opposite, that some groups invest reflective surfaces with profound ritual meaning long before mirrors are common tools. Human culture is variable enough to support both. That is why the record resists tidy conclusions. Reflection sits at the crossroads of optics and imagination, and people meet that crossroads differently. In the end, competing theories are not a weakness of the subject. They are part of what makes it honest. The first human recognition of a reflected self is not an event we can pin to a single date or mechanism. It is a convergence of capacities and conditions. Some of those conditions belong to evolution, some to childhood development, some to landscape, some to culture, some to technology. The theories disagree because the phenomenon itself is layered. A face in still water is simple only in appearance. Behind it stand questions about what a self is, how a body becomes an image, and why human beings cannot stop building meaning from the meeting between the two. By the time mirrors are crafted, traded, inherited, polished, buried, and feared, the original discovery has already done its work. Human beings have learned not only that they possess faces, but that those faces can be observed, adjusted, remembered, judged, and turned into symbols. From that point on, Reflection no longer belongs only to optics. It becomes one of the quiet engines of culture. The self seen from the outside begins to alter how humans make art, use cosmetics, imagine beauty, perform status, and even think about inner life. The consequences spread slowly, but they spread almost everywhere. One of the clearest effects appears in the growing human obsession with controlled appearance. A species that can see itself repeatedly begins to refine itself differently. Hair arrangements become more deliberate. Facial ornament becomes more precise. Cosmetic traditions deepen in complexity. The body is no longer only shaped for others, it is shaped with the help of one's own returning image. This changes scale and detail alike. A painted line can be corrected. Symmetry can be pursued. Damage can be concealed or emphasized. Age can be monitored. Reflection gives appearance continuity over time. A face becomes something worked on, not merely worn. What survives in the historical record suggests that cosmetics are never just decorative in the narrow sense. In ancient Egypt, kohl around the eyes may have aesthetic, medicinal, and protective associations at once. In many societies, skin treatment, pigment, hairstyling, and adornment overlap with fertility, purity, rank, mourning, seduction, or ritual passage. Reflection likely strengthens all of these by making the visible result available to the wearer. The image does not merely tell others what one has become, it tells the self as well. Scholars still debate the balance between practical, symbolic, and social motives in many cosmetic traditions, but no single explanation fully accounts for their persistence across such different cultures. The common thread is that humans care deeply about what the body looks like once it can be seen and managed. Art changes too, though not in a simple line. Human beings make images long before reliable mirrors are common, but reflection almost certainly influences how likeness is understood. A person who has seen their own face repeatedly may have a different relation to portraiture, masks, and figurative representation than one who has not. The face becomes a more inspectable object, a more stable reference. This does not mean realistic portraiture appears immediately wherever mirrors do. Cultural preferences matter. Some traditions favor idealization, symbolic features, or frontal abstraction over individual likeness. The evidence remains incomplete when trying to map mirror access directly onto artistic style. Yet it is hard to imagine the long history of portraiture, self-adornment, and facial realism being entirely untouched by the existence of stable reflections. There is a subtle psychological consequence here as well. Reflection creates feedback between inner feeling and outer form. A person can see worry on the brow, grief in the mouth, age around the eyes, exertion in the skin, paint transforming expression, costume changing posture. That can deepen self-knowledge, but it can also intensify self-surveillance. One begins not only to be, but to monitor being. The face becomes both lived and inspected. This is not a modern invention, though modern life magnifies it beyond anything earlier societies experienced. The root is much older. To see oneself is to become available for revision. This availability has enormous social consequences. Beauty standards become easier to stabilize and enforce in worlds where people can repeatedly compare themselves to ideals and to one another. Politeness and discipline also change. Facial composure can be practiced. Smiles can be arranged. Expressions can be moderated before public encounter. The human habit of performance already present in ritual, leadership, courtship, and conflict gains a private rehearsal space. The mirror, or any reliable reflective surface, becomes a training ground for the social face. What survives across many centuries suggests that the face becomes increasingly political as reflection becomes more regular in courts, temples, households, and urban life. The visible self matters not merely as ornament, but as evidence of character, class, purity, authority, or refinement. A groomed appearance can suggest discipline. A neglected one can signal exclusion, grief, poverty, madness, punishment, or deliberate renunciation. Reflection does not invent these meanings, but it sharpens the ability to cultivate or resist them. The self becomes something that can be aligned with social codes through visible effort. There is also the rise of self-portrait consciousness, even before literal self-portraiture in the modern sense becomes widespread. A person who can study their face repeatedly knows it as an object in a way that is difficult without reflection. This may contribute to how people imagine memory, legacy, and identity. The face is no longer only how others recognize you. It becomes part of how you recognize yourself across time. A scar acquired in youth, lines gathering in age. The changing relation between expression and habit, all these can now be watched. Reflection turns the face into a biography written in flesh. No single explanation fully accounts for why this matters so much to humans, but one answer lies in our unusual combination of social dependence and symbolic imagination. We are read constantly by others, and we know we are being read. Reflection lets us join that process from inside. Another answer lies in our fear of instability. A changing face confirms mortality, aging, stress, illness, and loss. To inspect oneself is also to confront time. Mirrors therefore support not only beautification, but anxiety, discipline, memory, and sometimes denial. They widen the self while also exposing its fragility. This is why reflection's legacy is double. It expands human freedom in one sense. A person can know their own visible form, manage it, transform it, make it expressive, ceremonial, seductive, or dignified, but it also expands pressure. One can now fail visibly in new ways. One can judge oneself against imagined norms. One can become divided between lived experience and outward image. The same surface that grants self-knowledge can breed dissatisfaction, vanity, shame, or obsessive refinement. These are not modern problems alone. They are latent wherever the self becomes an object of repeated visual attention. A lesser-known but important consequence is that reflection may have helped humans connect the face to individuality more strongly over time. In many early societies, identity is deeply relational, rooted in kin, status, role, place, and ritual condition. Yet as faces become more knowable to their owners, personal appearance can take on a stronger inward charge. This does not replace collective identity, but it adds a layer to it. I am not only daughter, hunter, mourner, initiate, ruler, priest. I also have this face, these marks, these changes, this visible continuity. Reflection thickens the felt texture of individuality without severing it from society. That thickening helps explain later developments in portrait medals, painted likenesses, private grooming kits, luxury mirrors, and eventually the modern flood of self-images. None of these begin from nothing. They are long consequences of the original human realization that the self can appear outside the body and still belong to it. Every later technique that captures, edits, idealizes, or compares. The face depends on that older conceptual bridge between inward person and outward image. The evidence remains incomplete when we try to track every stage of this transformation, and caution is still necessary. Mirror-rich societies are not automatically more introspective, more individualistic, or more self-aware in every respect. Human life is shaped by religion, law, kinship, economy, literacy, architecture, and countless other forces. Reflection is one thread among many, but it is a particularly intimate one. It works at the level of daily habit, silent preparation, and repeated encounter. Because of that, its influence can be profound even when it's not loudly recorded. What survives most clearly is the cumulative pattern. Once humans learn to see themselves reliably, they do not remain what they were before. They paint differently, groom differently, stage authority differently, imagine souls differently, and preserve faces differently. They become more practiced at the art of appearing. They grow more aware that the self has a visible surface and that this surface can be shaped. That knowledge enters culture so deeply that it becomes hard to imagine being human without it. And yet, in the longest view, the mirror changes humanity not by replacing older forms of selfhood, but by adding a new layer above them. Beneath every polished surface, the older self remains the self known through touch, movement, hunger, kinship, labor, grief, and memory. Reflection does not abolish that inner life. It gives it a second form, one made of light. From then on, every human culture that takes reflection seriously lives with both. The body felt from within, the body seen from without, the person lived, the person pictured. That doubled condition may be one of the most consequential inheritances in all of human history. Once the self becomes visible to itself, culture can do almost anything with the result. It can sanctify it, discipline it, beautify it, fear it, rank it, paint it, bury it, idealize it, and eventually reproduce it endlessly. All of that begins with a simple but destabilizing fact. The human face can appear in the world as an image, and once it does, humans never stop responding to it. Now the story reaches its widest point. What begins as a face in still water does not end with polished stone or hammered bronze. It continues forward through every age in which humans find new ways to catch themselves in surfaces, and each new surface changes not only what can be seen, but what it means to live as a visible being. The first reflection is ancient, accidental, fragile. The later history of reflection is deliberate, cumulative, and relentless. Yet the emotional structure remains strangely constant. A human confronts an image that is unmistakably the self and still, somehow, not fully the self. The great continuity is this: once humans learn that the self can be seen from outside, they begin organizing part of their lives around that fact. In one era, it may mean checking pigment in dark water before ritual. In another, it may mean a bronze mirror in an elite chamber. Later, it becomes polished glass, portraiture, photography, film, the front-facing camera, the black screen that suddenly lights and returns a face from inches away. The technologies change almost beyond recognition. The underlying human act does not. We continue to seek ourselves in surfaces. What survives across this long arc suggests that reflection has done more than help humans know how they look. It has changed the scale at which self-awareness operates. The ancient reflection lets a person discover that they have a face. Repeated mirror use lets them monitor that face across time. Portraits and images let them imagine how the face persists in memory and in the minds of strangers. Modern reflective and recording technologies multiply that effect so intensely that many people now encounter themselves more often as images than any human in earlier history could have imagined. Scholars still debate how radically this has transformed identity. But the shift is undeniable. The visible self has become one of the main environments in which modern people live, and yet the oldest layers remain underneath. Even in the age of glass and screens, the reflected self is never complete. A mirror shows a surface, not hunger, not pain, not memory, not the interior density of a life. It shows the face, but not the full person. This gap may be one reason humans keep returning to mirrors and images with a kind of dissatisfaction. We expect the self to become fully visible, and it never quite does. The face offers evidence, but not essence. It reveals enough to matter and not enough to settle anything. No single explanation fully accounts for the power reflection still has over us. Part of it is practical. We use mirrors to prepare, to clean, to heal, to present ourselves socially. Part of it is aesthetic. Human beings are drawn to symmetry, expression, and visible transformation. Part of it is social. We know we are seen by others, and reflection helps us anticipate that gaze. Part of it is existential. A reflected face confirms continuity and change at once. It says, this is me, and also, this is what time is doing to me. That final point may be one of the oldest and most enduring. The first human who recognizes their reflection does not only discover identity, they discover distance from themselves. They realize, however faintly, that they can be looked at, even by their own eyes, as though from elsewhere. This is the beginning not just of self-knowledge, but of self-observation. From there follow discipline, shame, beauty, style, theatre, composure, portraiture, vanity, introspection, and the endless human effort to reconcile inward experience with outward form. The evidence remains incomplete when we try to measure how much reflection alone contributed to these developments, and caution is still necessary. Human beings are shaped by language, kinship, ritual, violence, love, labour, landscape, and death no less than by mirrors. But what survives in the record of objects and behaviour suggests that reflection becomes one of the great quiet amplifiers. It does not invent personhood, yet it intensifies it. It does not create culture, yet it gives culture one more surface on which to write itself. It does not produce the soul, but it gives people a powerful image through which to imagine souls, doubles, hidden selves, and the fragile line between life and appearance. There is a strange tenderness in that. For most of the history of life on Earth, no creature ever clearly sees its own face and understands what it is seeing. Bodies move, feed, struggle, mate, age, and die without this particular loop of awareness. Then, in the long human story, a surface of water goes still. Light aligns. A mind prepared by evolution and culture meets an image it can finally interpret. That moment, whether it happens once or 1,000 times independently, is small in physical scale and immense in consequence. A face enters thought. From then on, the human world can never be entirely innocent of appearance again. We carry our own visibility with us. We become, in part, beings who know what we look like. That knowledge can be liberating, cruel, sacred, trivial, theatrical, or intimate. It can allow beauty and deception, dignity and anxiety, self-recognition and self-division. It can place a person more deeply in their own life or estrange them from it. The reflected self is never only a tool, it is always a relationship. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the first reflection. Not the invention of vanity, not the birth of consciousness, not a single dramatic awakening that explains everything afterward, but the beginning of an ongoing negotiation between body and image, between how it feels to be alive and how aliveness looks from the outside, between the self one inhabits and the self one can see. Human beings have been living inside that negotiation ever since. Even now, the oldest version of the experience remains the clearest. A quiet pool, no frame, no handle, no glass, no crafted technology between body and world, only surface, light, and a face appearing where no face should be. In that simple scene, the entire later history is already latent beauty, fear, ritual, status, philosophy, art, memory, and the uneasy knowledge that a person can become an image without ceasing to be a person. The water trembles, the face wavers, recognition holds. So the day humans first saw their reflection is not really a day at all. It is a threshold crossed many times, in many places, by many minds. It is an event diffused across prehistory and then concentrated in every culture that follows. It begins at the edges of rivers, springs, and caves, continues in obsidian and bronze, deepens in sacred and royal objects, and extends all the way to the present, where reflective surfaces and self-images surround us so completely that their strangeness is easy to forget. But the strangeness never actually disappears. A human image remains one of the most powerful things humans know how to make or meet, and somewhere behind every modern face caught in glass or screen, there is still that older human leaning over still water, discovering for the first time that the world can return a self. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable part of this story is how quiet it is. No monument marks the first human reflection. No king records it. No tool alone can claim it. It happens in places that leave little behind at the edge of water, in the stillness before wind rises, in a dark pool gathered inside stone, in the brief calm after rain. A face appears, then breaks apart, it returns, then fades, and somewhere within those repeated moments, human beings begin to understand that they are not only creatures moving through the world, they are also creatures who can see themselves moving through it. That realization does not make the world simpler, it makes it deeper. From then on, the self is never entirely hidden inside the body again. It can appear outside, made of light, carried on a surface, visible and fragile at once. The same discovery that allows beauty and ceremony also allows unease. This same reflective image that offers recognition also introduces distance. A person can look at themselves and feel both closeness and separation in the same instant. That tension never really goes away. It follows the human story from water to obsidian, from bronze to glass, from polished rooms to glowing screens. And still, beneath all the later meanings, the oldest scene remains the most powerful. Not because it is grand, but because it is so small. A single person, perhaps tired, perhaps curious, perhaps not expecting anything at all, leans over a surface and finds a face waiting there. Not another person, not a spirit proven, not a mystery solved. Just the strange and lasting fact that the self can become visible. That one truth opens outward into everything that follows: adornment, ritual, memory, fear, dignity, performance, and the long human habit of wondering what exactly a face can reveal. Time keeps moving after that first recognition, as it always does. Pools dry, rivers shift, caves darken, civilizations rise and vanish, mirrors are made, traded, buried, broken, polished again. Generations pass without knowing the names of those who first learned to read themselves in still water. But the act survives, again and again, Humans return to reflective surfaces and search for some confirmation that the person inside and the person visible are still, somehow, the same. Perhaps that is why the image remains so compelling. It is never only about appearance. It is about continuity, about change, about the fragile effort to recognize oneself while time is already at work. And so the story ends where it begins, with stillness, with light, with a human face suspended on the surface of the world for a moment before it trembles and is gone.